Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore a remarkable moment in British history. The Railway Mania of the 1840s, when an entire nation became intoxicated by the promise of steam and iron. When fortunes were made and lost on paper, when the future seemed to arrive faster than anyone could have imagined. We'll discover how Britain transformed itself through speculative fever, understand the dreams and disasters that came with it, and contemplate what this extraordinary episode teaches us about human nature, technological change, and the eternal dance between genuine progress and wild speculation. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a frantic recounting of market chaos or a sensational exploration of financial ruin. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the quiet world before railways, through the first amazing locomotives, through the fever that gripped Britain, and through the long aftermath. We'll take our time with the numbers, the stories, the quiet desperation, and unexpected triumph. By the end, I think you'll find that the Railway Mania was not just about trains or money, but about humanity reaching for the future, sometimes wisely, sometimes recklessly, always remarkably. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's most fascinating moments, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And let's begin our slow drift back to 1840s Britain, to a world being transformed by steam and iron, to a moment when the future arrived with the sound of a whistle and the rhythm of wheels on rails. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in the early 1800s, when the world moved slowly. Imagine Britain in 1800 before the railways came. Picture yourself needing to travel from London to Manchester, a journey of about 200 miles. You have choices, none of them pleasant. You could take a stagecoach cramped inside with other passengers, your body jolting with every rut in the road, breathing in the smell of unwashed bodies and leather, listening to the constant clatter of hooves. The journey would take the better part of 2 days if the weather was good. If it rained, the roads became ribbons of mud, and you might be stuck for hours, wheels mired, horses straining, passengers sometimes required to get out and push. Or you might travel by canal boat, gliding slowly along the waterways that had been cut through the British countryside over the previous century. This was smoother than the roads, certainly, but achingly slow. The boats were pulled by horses walking the towpath, and you moved at perhaps 3 miles per hour. London to Manchester by canal might take 4 or 5 days, longer if the locks were busy or the weather turned against you. The world was measured in different units then. Distance wasn't just miles, it was days, sometimes weeks. A letter sent from London might take a week to reach Edinburgh. Fresh fish caught on the coast would be spoiled before it reached towns 50 miles inland. News travelled at the speed of a galloping horse, which meant that important events might not be known for days in distant parts of the country. Consider what this meant for daily life. If you lived in a provincial town, you lived in a kind of isolation we can barely imagine now. London felt immensely far away, not just in miles, but in time and accessibility. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. The world was vast and slow and unchangeable. The roads themselves were often terrible. Outside the main routes they were little more than dirt tracks, rutted by cartwheels, turned to mud by rain, dusty and rough in dry weather. Highway robbery was a genuine concern. Coaches travelled armed, and passengers worried about being stopped by highwaymen on lonely stretches of road. Journey planning wasn't about convenience, it was about survival, about reaching your destination without accident, injury, or robbery. The canal system represented a kind of marvel, a network of artificial waterways that had transformed British commerce in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Canals could carry heavy goods, coal, iron, grain, manufactured products, far more efficiently than roads. A single canal boat could carry 50 tons of cargo, the equivalent of dozens of wagons. This had enabled Britain's Industrial Revolution, allowing factories to receive raw materials and send finished products to markets. Canal companies were profitable ventures, paying steady dividends to their shareholders. A canal share was considered a sound investment, something a prudent person might buy for steady income. The canals had shortened Britain, but only to a degree. They still moved at walking pace. They still took days to traverse. And then there was the coaching industry, an entire ecosystem of employment and enterprise. Coaching inns dotted the main routes, providing fresh horses every 10 or 15 miles, food and lodging for passengers. Coachmen, stable hands, innkeepers, blacksmiths. Thousands of people made their living from the movement of horse-drawn vehicles. The sound of a coach arriving was an event in small towns, bringing news, mail, passengers from the wider world. But beneath this familiar ancient system of movement, something new was stirring, something that would change everything. Steam power had been around for a while by the early 1800s. Stationary steam engines pumped water from mines, powered machinery and factories. They were massive, temperamental machines, requiring skilled operators and constant maintenance. The idea of putting a steam engine on wheels, of creating a locomotive that could pull itself and cargo along rails, seemed to many people fantastical, even absurd. There had been primitive railways for centuries, simple wooden rails in mines, allowing horses to pull heavier loads in carts. By the late 1700s, some mines used iron rails, but these were private industrial affairs, not public transport. The idea that ordinary people might travel on rails pulled by steam engines seemed odd at best, dangerous at worst. In 1804, a man named Richard Trevithick built the first steam locomotive to run on rails. It was a primitive thing, heavy and slow, but it worked. It pulled 10 tons of iron and 70 men nearly 10 miles. This was remarkable, but it seemed like a curiosity, a proof of concept without practical application. The locomotive was too heavy for the iron rails of the time. They kept breaking under its weight. Over the next 2 decades, various inventors and engineers experimented with steam locomotives. The technology improved slowly. Lighter engines, stronger rails, better boilers. These were incremental advances, interesting to engineers and industrialists, but not yet world-changing. Then came a man named George Stephenson. A self-taught engineer from Newcastle, Stephenson had worked in coal mines since childhood. He understood machines, understood coal, understood the practical problems of moving heavy loads. In the early 1820s, he began building improved locomotives and designing better railways. In 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in the north of England. This was the world's first public railway. Anyone could pay to have goods transported on it. The line was only about 25 miles long, primarily designed to carry coal from mines to the port. But it also carried passengers, though this was almost an afterthought. People could ride in carriages pulled by the locomotive, or more commonly, in horse-drawn coaches that ran on the rails. The Stockton and Darlington wasn't dramatic or revolutionary in obvious ways. It was a practical solution to a transport problem, profitable for its investors, useful for the coal industry. But it proved something crucial. Railways could work. They could be built, operated, made profitable. The technology was real, not fantasy. And people noticed. Particularly people in Liverpool and Manchester noticed. These 2 cities, separated by about 35 miles, were at the heart of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Manchester was the world's first industrial city, its cotton mills producing textiles for global markets. Liverpool was a great port, bringing in raw cotton from America and shipping out finished goods. The 2 cities needed each other desperately, but the connection between them was inadequate. The canal was slow and expensive, often congested. A faster, cheaper means of transport between Liverpool and Manchester could be enormously profitable. So a group of merchants and businessmen began planning a railway. Not a small industrial line like the Stockton and Darlington, but a proper passenger and freight railway connecting 2 major cities. They hired George Stephenson to build it. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway would be the prototype for all railways to come, the template that would transform the world. But we'll come to that. For now, picture Britain in the late 1820s, a country of rutted roads and slow canals where distance meant days, where most people lived their entire lives within a small radius, where the future looked much like the past. The railways were coming, but almost no one understood what that would mean. Almost no one could imagine how completely the world was about to change. Let that image settle in your mind. Feel the slowness of that world, the constraints of distance and time. Let yourself drift back to an England where the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones was the rhythm of commerce, where the smell of horses and coal smoke filled the air, where the future was arriving quietly, in the form of iron rails and steam engines, not yet recognised for what it was, a revolution in the very nature of space and time. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened on September 15th, 1830, and nothing in Britain would ever be quite the same again. The opening day was meant to be a celebration, a grand ceremony befitting what everyone involved knew was a momentous occasion. 8 trains were prepared, carrying dignitaries, investors, members of Parliament, and curious observers. The Duke of Wellington attended, Britain's greatest military hero, the man who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. His presence signalled that this was an event of national importance, not merely a commercial venture. George Stephenson's locomotive, the Northumbrian, led the procession. The other locomotives followed, each pulling carriages filled with well-dressed passengers. Crowds lined the route. Thousands of people gathered to witness this unprecedented sight. Trains moving at speeds no one had experienced before. Imagine standing by those tracks, feeling the ground tremble slightly as the locomotive approached, hearing the unfamiliar sound of the steam engine, seeing something that looked like the future made tangible in iron and smoke. The trains reached speeds of 30 miles per hour. 30 miles per hour. This sounds almost absurdly slow to us now, but to people in 1830 it was flying. It was faster than a galloping horse. Faster than anything human beings had ever travelled except perhaps in a fall. Passengers described the sensation with wonder and sometimes terror. The countryside seemed to blur past. Trees became streaks. The wind rushed through the open carriages. Some people felt exhilarated, others frightened. A few became physically ill from the speed. But the day, which should have been purely triumphant, became tragic in a moment that no one could have anticipated. At Parkside, about 17 miles into the journey, the train stopped to take on water. Passengers were warned to stay in their carriages, but many got out to stretch their legs, to examine the locomotives, to socialise. Among them was William Hudson, a Member of Parliament and former Cabinet Minister, a man of considerable importance in British political life. Hudson crossed the tracks to speak with the Duke of Wellington, who was in a carriage on the opposite track. While they were talking, another locomotive approached on the adjacent line. Someone shouted a warning. Most people scrambled to safety. Hudson, perhaps confused, perhaps simply unlucky, hesitated. He tried to climb back into Wellington's carriage but couldn't manage it quickly enough. The locomotive struck him, crushing his leg. He was placed in a carriage, and Stephenson's Northumbrian carried him at unprecedented speed to Eccles, where doctors waited. They did what they could, but the injury was catastrophic. Hudson died that evening, becoming the first person killed in a railway accident, dying on the very day that passenger railways were born. This tragedy cast a shadow over the opening, but it didn't stop the railway from operating. After a delay, the trains continued to Manchester. The crowds there, unaware of the accident, gave the railway a rapturous welcome. The contrast was almost unbearable. Celebration and death intertwined, the future arriving with both promise and peril. Let's pause with that moment for a bit. Let yourself sit with the complexity of it. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway represented genuine progress, a real improvement in human capability. But progress always carries risk, always demands something from us. Hudson's death was mourned, but it didn't slow the railway age. If anything, the tragedy made the railways more famous, more talked about. People were horrified, but they were also fascinated. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway began regular service, and its commercial success exceeded even optimistic projections. The railway charged passengers significantly less than the stagecoaches had, yet because it could carry so many more people, revenue was enormous. First-class passengers paid 5 shillings for the journey, Second class paid 3 shillings and sixpence, third class even less. The coaches had charged considerably more and taken much longer. The speed was intoxicating. What had been a day's uncomfortable journey by coach now took less than 2 hours. Businessmen could travel from Liverpool to Manchester in the morning, conduct their affairs, and return the same day. This had never been possible before. Time itself seemed to have compressed, distance to have shrunk. The psychological impact was profound. Freight transport was equally revolutionary. Coal, cotton, manufactured goods, all could move between the cities faster and cheaper than ever before. The railway charged less than half what the canal companies had charged and delivered goods in hours rather than days. The canals, which had seemed like the permanent infrastructure of British commerce, suddenly looked obsolete. The railway company's investors watched with satisfaction as dividends began to flow. The Liverpool and Manchester had cost about £800,000 to build, an enormous sum raised from hundreds of shareholders. Those shareholders had taken a risk on unproven technology, and now they were being rewarded. Early dividends were around 9 or 10% per year, far better than government bonds, which paid perhaps 3 or 4%. The railway wasn't just successful, it was profitable beyond expectation. Let's think about what a railway share actually was, because this will become important as we move through our story. A railway company was organised as a joint stock company. This meant that ownership was divided into shares that could be bought and sold. If you owned 10 shares out of 10,000, you owned 1,000th of the company. You had a vote at company meetings proportional to your shareholding, and you received dividends, a portion of the company's profits distributed to shareholders. This structure wasn't new. Joint stock companies had existed for centuries. The great trading companies of the previous era, the East India Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, were joint stock companies. But they were relatively rare, generally requiring a royal charter or Act of Parliament to form. Railways would popularise the joint stock structure, making it the standard way of organising large business ventures. Railway shares could be traded. If you owned shares in the Liverpool and Manchester Railway but needed money, you could sell them to someone else. A secondary market emerged, brokers who would buy and sell railway shares, coffee houses where men gathered to discuss and trade shares. This meant that railway investment wasn't entirely locked up. You could, in theory, get your money out if you needed it. Of course, the price you received when selling might be higher or lower than what you'd originally paid, depending on the company's prospects and the demand for shares. The Liverpool and Manchester proved that railway shares could be valuable investments. As the company's success became apparent, the value of its shares increased. Someone who had bought shares before the railway opened could sell them for considerably more than they'd paid. This wasn't just dividend income. This was capital appreciation, wealth created seemingly from nothing, or rather from the railway's proven ability to generate profit. Word spread. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway was making money, its shareholders were prospering, and Britain needed more railways. The success of this single line raised an obvious question. If a railway between Liverpool and Manchester was so profitable, what about London to Birmingham? What about London to Bristol? What about connecting all the major cities of Britain? But beyond the commercial calculations, something else was happening. Something psychological, almost spiritual. People who had experienced railway travel described it in terms that sound almost mystical to us now. The sensation of speed, the conquest of distance, the way the railway seemed to shrink the country, these weren't just practical benefits. They felt like magic, like a glimpse of a different kind of world. Consider what it felt like for someone in 1831 or 1832 to board a train for the first time. You would walk into a railway station, itself a new kind of building, purpose-built for this new form of transport. You would buy a ticket, another novelty, a printed piece of paper that granted you passage. You would climb into a railway carriage, which looked something like a stagecoach but was longer, attached to other carriages in a chain. Then the locomotive would sound its whistle, a sharp, otherworldly sound. The train would begin to move, slowly at first, then faster, faster than any vehicle you'd ever been in. The world outside would begin to blur. You would feel the vibration of the rails beneath you, smell the coal smoke from the locomotive, hear the rhythmic sound of the wheels, and you would arrive at your destination in a fraction of the time it would have taken by any other means. People wrote letters describing their first railway journeys. They used words like wonderful, astonishing, miraculous. Some found it frightening, the speed was unnatural, the noise unsettling. There were concerns that the human body couldn't withstand such velocity, that women might suffer health problems from the vibration, that the rapid passage through tunnels might cause madness. These fears sound absurd now, but they reflected genuine uncertainty about what this new technology might do to human bodies and minds. But fear was overwhelmed by fascination. Within a few years of the Liverpool and Manchester opening, riding on a railway became something people did for pleasure, not just necessity. Excursion trains were organised, special services carrying hundreds of people to the seaside or to special events. The railway was becoming part of British life, not just as transport but as experience, as entertainment, a symbol of the modern age. George Stephenson became famous, celebrated as the father of the railway age. He was consulted on other railway projects. His expertise sought across Britain and beyond. The self-taught engineer from the coal mines had become one of the most important men in Britain, the embodiment of British ingenuity and industrial prowess. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway's success attracted attention from engineers, investors, and civic leaders across the country. If Liverpool and Manchester could be connected by rail, why not other cities? The early 1830s saw a steady increase in railway proposals and construction. These weren't wild schemes, not yet. They were careful, well-planned projects, often connecting industrial cities or linking cities to ports. The Grand Junction Railway, connecting Birmingham to the Liverpool and Manchester line, opened in 1837. The London and Birmingham Railway, a much more ambitious project, opened in 1838, finally linking the capital to the growing railway network of the north. These were major engineering achievements. The London and Birmingham required massive earthworks, deep cuttings through hills, long embankments over valleys, tunnels through obstacles. The cost was enormous, over £5 million. But again, the result was profitable. Again, shareholders received dividends. Again, the railway proved its worth. By the late 1830s, Britain had several hundred miles of railway track. Not a complete network, but the beginnings of one. You could travel from London to Liverpool by rail. Changing trains at Birmingham. The journey that would have taken 3 or 4 days by coach now took about 12 hours. This was still a long journey, to be sure, but the compression of time was extraordinary. The social impact was beginning to be felt. Newspapers in London could reach Manchester the same day they were printed, carried by express train. Fresh fish from coastal ports could reach inland cities while still fresh. Business relationships became easier to maintain across distance. The wealthy could live in pleasant suburbs and commute to city offices, something that had never been practical before, and the investors, those early shareholders who had taken a risk on this new technology, were being rewarded. Railway shares were becoming recognised as a new class of investment, distinct from government bonds or canal shares. They were riskier than bonds. Railways could fail, profits were not guaranteed, but they offered higher returns. For someone with capital to invest, railways were beginning to look very attractive. Let yourself imagine being an investor in 1838 or 1839. Perhaps you're a merchant in a provincial city, or a professional person, a doctor, a lawyer, a clergyman, with some savings. You've watched the Liverpool and Manchester Railway succeed. You've perhaps travelled on a railway yourself, experienced the marvel of it. You've heard about the dividends being paid, 9%, 10%, sometimes more. You compare this to the 3% you're earning on government bonds and you think about investing in railways. This seems reasonable, even prudent. Railways are the future. Everyone can see that. They're transforming Britain, creating value, serving genuine needs. Investing in a railway isn't wild speculation. It's participating in progress, in the building of modern Britain. Your returns would be good, and you'd be contributing to something important, something that's making life better for everyone. This was the mood in the late 1830s. Optimistic, yes, but grounded in reality. The railways that existed were mostly successful. The technology worked, the business model worked. There was every reason to believe that more railways would be equally successful, that Britain's future would be a railway future, that investing in that future was wise. No one could have predicted how far that optimism would go, how thoroughly it would overtake rational calculation, how the slow, steady growth of the railway network would suddenly accelerate into frenzy. But we'll come to that. For now, picture Britain in 1840, a country with a few hundred miles of railway, a country where the future had arrived but hadn't yet overwhelmed the present, where the promise of railways seemed clear and the dangers still hidden. Picture investors beginning to pay close attention, beginning to think that perhaps they should own some railway shares, beginning to dream of the profits that might come from this extraordinary new technology. Let that image rest in your mind. The railways proven, profitable, transforming. The investors attentive, interested, not yet obsessed. The country on the edge of something momentous, not yet aware of how completely the railway mania would soon grip the nation. The early 1840s brought a steady expansion of Britain's railway network, a period of growth that seemed controlled, purposeful, almost inevitable. This wasn't yet the mania that would come later, but rather something that looked like rational development, like a nation sensibly building the infrastructure its future required. Railway schemes multiplied across Britain. Not wildly, not chaotically, but with what appeared to be careful planning. Cities wanted to be connected to the growing network. Investors saw opportunities. Engineers proposed routes. And Parliament, which had to approve each railway through a private act, considered these proposals and granted permission to those that seemed sound. This parliamentary process is worth understanding, because it would become crucial to the story that unfolds. Unlike building a road or a canal, which might be done under existing laws, each railway company needed its own Act of Parliament. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was necessary because railways required compulsory purchase of land. The railway had to run in a straight or gently curving line, and if a landowner refused to sell, the project would be impossible. So Parliament granted railways the power of compulsory purchase, forcing landowners to accept compensation and allow the railway to cross their property. Getting a private act through Parliament was expensive and time-consuming. First, the railway company had to be formed, with initial investors putting up money for the preliminary expenses. Engineers had to survey the proposed route, calculating gradients, identifying where bridges and tunnels would be needed, estimating costs. Then a bill would be presented to Parliament. Landowners along the route could petition against it. Rival interests, canal companies whose business would be threatened, turnpike trusts whose toll roads would lose traffic, could oppose the bill. Parliamentary committees would hear evidence, examine plans, question engineers and company directors. Legal fees mounted. If the opposition was strong, the costs could become enormous even before a single rail was laid. But if the bill passed, the railway company received its act, granting it the legal right to build, to purchase land, to operate trains. Only then could the serious construction begin. This process acted as a kind of filter. It was expensive enough that frivolous schemes usually couldn't proceed. It required genuine planning and engineering work. It meant that each railway had been examined, debated, approved by Parliament. This created a sense of legitimacy, of governmental approval, that would later become important when investors tried to evaluate which railway schemes were sound. The railways approved and built in the early 1840s were generally sensible projects. The Great Western Railway, connecting London to Bristol and the west of England, was one of the most ambitious. Its chief engineer was a man named Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who would become one of the great figures of the railway age. Brunel was young, brilliant, ambitious. He had trained as an engineer under his father, worked on the Thames Tunnel project, and at just 27 years old, was appointed chief engineer of the Great Western Railway. Where George Stephenson was practical and self-taught, Brunel was educated and visionary. He saw railways not just as transport, but as a complete reimagining of how engineering could shape the world. Brunel made a controversial decision that would have lasting consequences. Most railways, following Stephenson's example, used a track gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, the distance between the rails. This was based on the gauge of coal mine wagons in the north of England, itself derived from the width of ancient cart ruts. It was arbitrary, but it had become standard. Brunel thought this was too narrow. He designed the Great Western Railway with a gauge of 7 feet and a quarter inch, nearly 3 feet wider. He argued this would allow larger, more stable, faster trains. And he was probably right. His broad gauge trains were more comfortable, and could run faster than standard gauge trains. But the decision created incompatibility. Trains from the Great Western Railway couldn't run on other lines. Freight had to be transferred at the boundary between broad gauge and standard gauge networks. This gauge difference would eventually prove a problem, but in the early 1840s it seemed like an acceptable trade-off for superior performance. Brunel was building a railway that was meant to be the finest in the world, and he refused to compromise his vision for the sake of compatibility with inferior systems. The Great Western Railway required extraordinary engineering. The line ran through varied terrain: the Chiltern Hills, the Thames Valley, the Downs of Wiltshire, the Cotswolds. Brunel designed elegant bridges, massive embankments, impressive viaducts. The Box Tunnel near Bath was nearly 2 miles long, one of the longest railway tunnels in the world at the time. Thousands of workers laboured for years, cutting through rock, building structures that would last centuries. The cost was enormous. The original estimate had been about £2.5 million. The actual cost approached £6.5 million. Shareholders who had expected to see profits within a few years instead saw their dividends delayed as the company poured money into construction. Some grumbled, some sold their shares. But most held on, trusting Brunel's vision, believing that when the railway was complete, the returns would justify the expense, and they were right. When the Great Western Railway opened fully in 1841, it was magnificent. The stations were grand structures, architectural statements. The trains ran smoothly and fast. The broad gauge allowed larger carriages, more comfortable seating. It was a railway designed not just for utility but for experience, for making railway travel something elegant and modern. Other railways followed different philosophies. The London and Birmingham Railway, opened in 1838, was more conservative in design but equally impressive in execution. The Midland Railway connected the industrial cities of the Midlands. The South Eastern Railway began linking London to the Channel ports. The Eastern Counties Railway served East Anglia. Each required an Act of Parliament. Each required enormous capital investment. Each transformed the regions it served. By 1842, Britain had roughly 2,000 miles of railway track. This was more than the rest of the world combined. Britain was becoming a railway nation, stitched together by iron rails, in a way that would have been unimaginable 20 years earlier. The canal system, which had seemed permanent, was already in decline. Coaching inns were closing. The whole geography of British life was being redrawn. The people building these railways, the navvies, as they were called, deserve our attention for a moment. These were labourers who worked with pick and shovel, moving earth, cutting through hills, building embankments. The word navvy came from navigator, the term used for canal workers. Railway construction required massive earthworks. Hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of soil and rock had to be moved, all by hand and horse. Navvies lived in rough camps near the construction sites. Moving as the railway advanced, they were paid well by the standards of the time, more than agricultural labourers, but the work was brutal. Injuries were common. Men fell from scaffolding, were crushed by rock falls, died in tunnel collapses. There was no compensation for injured workers, no safety regulations beyond what individual contractors might choose to implement. These men, often Irish immigrants or displaced agricultural workers, built the physical infrastructure of the railway age with their muscles and their lives. They don't appear in the financial ledgers except as labour costs, but they were as essential to the railways as the engineers or the investors. The embankments you can still see across Britain, the cuttings through hills, the foundations of bridges. These were dug and shaped and built by human labour on a scale that's hard to imagine now. The engineering challenges of railway construction were immense. A railway, unlike a road, can't have steep gradients. Locomotives of the time couldn't pull heavy loads up significant slopes, so railways had to be as level as possible. This meant that hills had to be cut through or tunnelled under, valleys had to be crossed on viaducts or filled with embankments. Rivers required bridges. The engineering was elegant but demanding. Brunel's Maidenhead Railway Bridge, for instance, crossed the Thames with the flattest brick arches ever built at that scale. Critics said the arches would collapse under the weight of trains. Brunel was so confident in his calculations that he left the wooden scaffolding in place after construction, silencing doubters, then quietly removed it later when he was satisfied the bridge was stable. It still carries trains today, nearly 2 centuries later. These engineering achievements became sources of national pride. Britain was leading the world in railway technology. British engineers were consulted on railway projects across Europe and in America. British locomotives were exported globally. The railways were proof of British ingenuity, British industrial supremacy, British modernity. And for investors, the railways continued to prove attractive. Not all railways were immediately profitable. Construction delays and cost overruns sometimes meant years without dividends. But the successful railways paid handsomely. The Grand Junction Railway, opened in 1837, paid dividends of 10% or more to its shareholders. Even the London and Birmingham, despite its high construction costs, eventually began returning steady profits. Railway shares began to be seen as a distinct class of investment. Government bonds were safe but boring, paying 3 or 4% and never changing much in value. Canal shares had been good investments in their day, but the canals were clearly being superseded by railways. Corporate stocks in manufacturing or mining companies existed but were less common, less liquid, sometimes difficult to buy or sell. Railway shares offered something different. They were relatively easy to trade, backed by tangible assets, part of an exciting new industry, and potentially quite profitable. The typical railway investor in the early 1840s was not a wealthy aristocrat or a city banker, though some of those certainly invested. The typical investor was middle class, a prosperous merchant, a professional person, someone with savings they could invest. Shares in most railway companies cost £10 or £20 each, affordable for someone with moderate capital. You might buy 10 shares, investing a couple of £100, hoping for steady dividends and perhaps some appreciation in value. Women were notably present among railway investors. This might seem surprising, but railway shares were one of the few investments considered appropriate for women. A widow with money from her late husband, or a woman with an inheritance, couldn't easily start a business or buy property in her own name. But she could own railway shares. They paid regular dividends that could provide income. They were seen as respectable, not speculative. So women, particularly widows and unmarried women with independent means, became significant shareholders in railway companies. The social aspect of railway investment was important too. People discussed railway schemes in drawing rooms and coffee houses. Newspapers reported on railway company meetings, on new lines being proposed, on dividend payments. If your friends or family members were investing in railways and doing well, you were likely to consider doing the same. Investment decisions weren't made in isolation. They were part of social life, subject to social influences. By 1843, the atmosphere around railways was optimistic but still relatively restrained. Yes, there were many railway schemes being proposed. Yes, share prices for successful railways were rising. But there was also a sense that railway construction was being managed sensibly, that Parliament was gatekeeping effectively, that the expansion was controlled. The economy more broadly was recovering from the difficulties of the early 1840s. There had been a recession, unemployment, social unrest. The Chartist movement had demanded political reforms, with massive demonstrations and petitions. But by 1843, economic conditions were improving. Harvests were better, employment was rising, interest rates on government bonds were low, which meant that people with money to invest were searching for better returns. This created perfect conditions for what was about to happen. Capital was available, returns on safe investments were low, railways had proven themselves profitable and transformative. The parliamentary process created a sense of legitimacy. Engineering was advancing rapidly, making previously impossible routes feasible. And everywhere you looked, railways were changing Britain for the better, speeding travel, lowering costs, connecting cities, creating prosperity. It all seemed to point in one direction. More railways were needed, more railways would be built, more investment opportunities would arise, and those who invested early would profit as late investors drove up share prices. This logic was compelling. It was also, as we'll see, dangerous when taken to extremes. But in 1843 and early 1844, the extremes hadn't yet arrived. Railway investment was growing, but it wasn't yet a mania. It was still possible to evaluate railway schemes critically, to distinguish between well-planned routes and dubious proposals, to invest with some degree of caution. The railway network was expanding, but the expansion still made sense, still served real needs, still created genuine value. Picture Britain in 1844, a country laced with perhaps 2,500 miles of railway, a country where travelling from London to York, which would have taken days by coach, now took less than a day by train, a country where fresh milk from the countryside could reach city markets before souring, a country where businessmen maintained connections across hundreds of miles as easily as they once did across tens of miles. Picture investors, professionals, merchants, clergy, widows, considering railway shares, reading prospectuses, attending company meetings, calculating likely returns, making what seemed like prudent decisions about where to put their money. Excited about the future certainly, but not yet swept away by it. Still grounded, still rational. This moment of balance wouldn't last. The forces that would create the railway mania were already building. Low interest rates, abundant capital, proven railway profitability, social contagion, parliamentary legitimacy, engineering confidence. All the ingredients were present. They just needed one more element, a spark, a trigger, a moment when optimism would tip over into euphoria, when rational investment would become frenzied speculation. That moment was coming. 1844 would give way to 1845, and in 1845, the world would see just how thoroughly a nation could lose its collective head over an investment opportunity. But for now, in this quiet moment before the storm, Britain was simply building railways, sensibly and steadily, creating the infrastructure that would serve it for generations, unaware that it was about to be engulfed by one of history's great speculative manias. Let that moment rest. The calm before the frenzy, the rational planning before the madness, the future arriving at a measured pace, not yet overwhelming the present. Sleep comes easier when we linger in these quiet moments, before history accelerates into chaos. So rest here for a while, in 1844 Britain, watching the railways spread across the land like a slow web of iron and steam, beautiful and useful, and not yet dangerous, not yet a fever, not yet a mania. Just progress, steady and true. Just the future, arriving as it should. The year 1844 ended quietly enough, but beneath the surface of British economic life, something was shifting. Interest rates remained low. Government bonds yielded only 3%, sometimes less. Money sat in bank accounts earning minimal returns. People with capital, and Britain in the mid-1840s had many people with capital, searched for somewhere to put it, somewhere that might offer better returns than the anemic yields available from safe investments. Railways beckoned. The successful lines paid dividends of 8, 9, 10%, some even more. These weren't speculative promises, these were actual payments, quarterly distributions of profit to shareholders. If you'd invested £1,000 in the Grand Junction Railway or the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, you were receiving £80 or £90 or £100 per year. Compare this to the £30 you'd receive from government bonds, and the attraction becomes obvious. But there was a problem, if you can call it that. The good railways were already built or being built. Their shares traded at prices well above their original issue price. If you wanted to buy into the Liverpool and Manchester Railway now, in 1844 you couldn't buy shares at the original price. You'd have to pay whatever the current market price was, which reflected the company's proven profitability. You could still make money, dividends would still flow, but you'd missed the initial opportunity, the chance to buy cheap and watch the value rise. What investors wanted were new railways, new schemes, new opportunities to buy shares at the beginning, at the low price, before the railway opened and proved profitable. And in 1844 and early 1845, new railway schemes began to appear. At first, just a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. The process of promoting a railway followed a pattern. A group of men, merchants, local businessmen, perhaps a few wealthy landowners, would identify a route they believed needed a railway, perhaps connecting two towns that weren't yet linked, perhaps providing an alternative route to compete with an existing railway, perhaps serving an industrial region rich in coal or iron. They would hire an engineer to survey the route and estimate costs. Then they would create a provisional committee, draft a prospectus, and invite the public to subscribe for shares. The prospectus was a crucial document. It described the proposed railway, explained why it was needed, provided the engineers' cost estimates, and most importantly, projected the likely profits and dividends. These projections were often remarkably optimistic. The prospectus might claim that once completed, the railway would generate revenues of £200,000 per year, with expenses of only £100,000, leaving a profit of £100,000. If the total capital of the company was £1 million, this would represent a 10% return. Sometimes the projections claimed even higher returns, 12%, 15%. How were these numbers derived? Sometimes through careful analysis of existing traffic on roads or canals projected onto the railway, sometimes through hopeful assumptions about how a railway would generate entirely new traffic, sometimes through sheer imagination. Numbers chosen to make the scheme attractive to investors. The prospectuses rarely included worst-case scenarios or acknowledged the significant risk that the railway might never be built or might prove unprofitable. To subscribe for shares, you didn't have to pay the full price up front. This was crucial. If a share had a nominal value of £20, you might only need to deposit £2 or even £1 when subscribing. The rest would be paid in instalments, called calls, as construction progressed and the company needed money. This meant that with a relatively small amount of capital, you could subscribe for a large number of shares. Think about what this meant. With £200, you could subscribe for 100 shares with a nominal value of £2,000. If the railway was approved by Parliament and began construction, if the shares rose in value on the secondary market, you could sell them at a profit without ever having paid the full price. You'd invested £200 and might sell the shares for £3,000 or more, pocketing a £1,000 profit on a £200 investment. This was leverage, though the word wasn't used in quite that way then. Of course, there were risks. If the railway scheme failed to get parliamentary approval, if it was abandoned, you'd lose your deposit. If the company made additional calls for capital and you couldn't pay, you'd forfeit your shares and what you'd already paid. If the railway was built but proved unprofitable, your shares might become worthless. But in the optimistic atmosphere of 1844 and early 1845, these risks seemed small compared to the potential rewards. A man named George Hudson embodied the era's opportunities and ambitions. Hudson had started as a linen draper in York, a respectable but unremarkable tradesman. He had inherited money from a distant relative, invested it in railways, and discovered he had a talent for railway management and promotion. By the early 1840s, he controlled several railway companies in northern England and was working to amalgamate them into larger networks. Hudson understood something that many other railway promoters didn't fully grasp. Individual railways were useful, but networks were transformative. A railway from York to Leeds was good. But if that railway connected to another line going to Manchester, and that connected to lines going to Liverpool and London, suddenly you had a system that could move passengers and freight across much of England. Hudson worked to create such systems, buying up smaller railways, negotiating connections, building what would eventually become major railway networks. He was charismatic, energetic, politically connected. He entertained lavishly, cultivated relationships with aristocrats and politicians, presented himself as a visionary of the railway age. The press called him the Railway King. He served as Lord Mayor of York and as a Member of Parliament. He seemed to embody the possibility that railways offered, that a man of modest origins could, through intelligence and ambition and timely investment, become wealthy and powerful. Hudson's railways paid good dividends. Shareholders were happy. His railway shares rose in value. More people wanted to invest in whatever schemes he promoted. He became, in himself, a kind of brand, a guarantee that a railway would be successful. If George Hudson was involved, investors felt confident. This confidence would eventually prove misplaced. But in 1844, Hudson seemed like a man who understood the future and could deliver profits. The early months of 1845 saw the pace of railway promotion accelerate. The Railway Times, a newspaper devoted entirely to railway news and share prices, grew thicker with each issue as more schemes were announced. The registration of new railway companies, which had been perhaps a few dozen per year in the early 1840s, jumped to over 100 in 1845, then kept climbing. Prospectuses appeared for railways connecting nearly every city and town of any size. Some were sensible schemes filling genuine gaps in the network. Others were dubious, competing lines serving routes that already had railways, or routes through sparsely populated areas unlikely to generate much traffic. And some were barely more than names on paper, routes sketched on maps with no serious engineering study or cost analysis. But investors increasingly didn't distinguish between these different types of schemes. They saw that railway shares generally rose in value after subscription, that early investors made money, that the mania was building momentum. The fear of missing out, though the phrase didn't exist yet, the emotion certainly did, drove people to subscribe for shares in schemes they barely understood. Railway investment became a topic of obsessive interest. Newspapers published lists of new schemes, updates on parliamentary progress, reports of share prices. Brokerage firms opened to facilitate the buying and selling of railway shares. Coffee houses in London and provincial cities became informal stock exchanges, where men gathered to trade shares and gossip about which schemes looked promising. The social dynamics of the mania were fascinating and powerful. If your brother-in-law mentioned that he'd subscribed for shares in the Eastern and Midlands Railway and they'd already risen 20% in value, you felt foolish for not having done the same. If your neighbours were discussing railway investments at dinner parties, you wanted to be able to contribute to the conversation, to show that you too were alert to opportunities. If you read in the newspaper that thousands of people were subscribing for shares in some new scheme, you wondered if you should as well. This wasn't entirely irrational. There was real money being made. People who had subscribed early to certain schemes really were selling their shares at significant profits. The success stories were visible and talked about. The failures, the schemes that collapsed, the deposits lost, were less discussed, easier to ignore or explain away as the fault of poor judgment in choosing which railways to invest in. Women participated in the mania as avidly as men, perhaps more so. Railway shares were one of the few investment vehicles available to women, and many took advantage. Widows with inherited wealth, unmarried women with independent means, even married women managing household finances, all bought railway shares. Some women became quite sophisticated investors, studying prospectuses, attending company meetings, making calculated decisions about which schemes to support. Others simply followed the herd, investing because everyone else seemed to be. The prospectuses themselves became more elaborate and enticing. They featured testimonials from prominent citizens supporting the scheme. They included detailed maps showing the proposed route. They cited statistics about existing traffic that the railway would capture. They promised dividends that would make investors wealthy. Reading these documents, it was easy to believe that the particular railway being promoted was a sure thing, a guaranteed path to prosperity. Some prospectuses were honest, based on genuine analysis and realistic projections. Others were essentially fraudulent, filled with invented numbers and impossible promises. But for the average investor, distinguishing between the two was nearly impossible. How could a clerk or a shopkeeper or a country parson evaluate whether a projected revenue of £300,000 per year was realistic? They had no basis for judgment except the confidence with which the projection was stated and the reputation of the men promoting the scheme. The role of engineers in promoting schemes deserves attention. An established engineer like Brunel or Robert Stephenson, George Stephenson's son, who had become a prominent railway engineer in his own right, lent enormous credibility to a scheme. If Robert Stephenson said a route was feasible and would cost £2 million to build, investors believed him. The problem was that there weren't enough established engineers to survey all the proposed railways. Lesser-known engineers, some with limited experience, were hired to provide surveys and cost estimates, and some of these estimates were optimistic to the point of fantasy, either because the engineer lacked expertise or because he was under pressure from promoters to keep estimated costs low to make the scheme attractive. By the summer of 1845, the mania was unmistakable. The number of railway schemes registered that year would eventually exceed 600. Not all would seek parliamentary approval, and many that did would fail. But the sheer volume was extraordinary. The total capital these schemes proposed to raise exceeded £200 million, more than twice the annual budget of the British government. Think about what this meant. Britain's existing railway network had cost perhaps £70 or £80 million to build. Now, in a single year, schemes were being promoted that would require more than twice that amount. There simply wasn't enough capital in Britain to fund all these railways, even if they were all worthy projects, which they certainly weren't. And there definitely weren't enough skilled engineers, enough navvies, enough iron and timber and stone to build them all simultaneously. But in the euphoria of mid-1845, these practical constraints seemed irrelevant. The focus was on the opportunity, on the profits to be made, on the transformation of Britain into a fully railway-connected nation. Sceptical voices existed. The Economist newspaper, founded in 1843 by James Wilson, consistently warned that railway shares were overvalued, that many schemes would fail, that investors were courting disaster. But these warnings were drowned out by the chorus of optimism, dismissed as the concerns of people who didn't understand the new era that railways were ushering in. The speculation wasn't limited to new schemes. Shares in existing railways also rose dramatically in value. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway shares, which had traded at around £150 in the early 1840s, rose to over £250. The London and Birmingham Railway shares similarly appreciated. This seemed to validate the mania. If established railways were becoming more valuable, surely new railways would also prove valuable. But this reasoning confused cause and effect. The established railways were becoming more valuable partly because investors were taking profits from rising share prices and using that money to buy established shares, seeking stability, and partly because the mania itself was driving up all railway shares, regardless of their fundamental value. The market was feeding on itself, rising because it was rising, detached from the actual profitability of the underlying railways. By autumn of 1845, the mania reached its peak. Share prices for both established railways and promising new schemes were at all-time highs. Subscription lists for new railways filled within hours of opening. Stories circulated of investors making fortunes, of clerks who had become wealthy through clever railway speculation, of widows who had secured their futures through timely investments. But peaks, by their nature, precede declines. And in the last months of 1845, subtle signs of trouble began to appear. Share prices for some schemes began to falter. Certain heavily promoted railways failed to attract as many subscribers as expected. A few schemes were quietly abandoned when it became clear they couldn't raise sufficient capital. The Bank of England, concerned about inflation and excessive credit, began to raise interest rates slightly. These were small warnings, easily dismissed or ignored by investors caught up in the enthusiasm. But they were there, visible to anyone who chose to look. The mania had reached its furthest extent. The autumn of 1845 was the high point, the moment when optimism was greatest, when the belief in unlimited railway prosperity was most widespread, when the most people held railway shares expecting them to continue rising indefinitely. What came next? The turn, the recognition that something was wrong, the slow then sudden collapse, would happen gradually through 1846 and into 1847. But the peak had arrived. Britain in autumn 1845 was a nation intoxicated by railway speculation, confident in an endless future of iron roads and generous dividends, unaware that the ground beneath its feet was already beginning to shift. Let yourself rest in this moment of peak enthusiasm, before the recognition of excess, before the reckoning. There's something almost innocent about it, this collective belief in boundless opportunity, this faith that railways would make everyone prosperous. It was misguided, yes, but it came from genuine excitement about technological transformation, from real evidence of railway success, from understandable human hope for a better future. The people caught up in the railway mania weren't fools. They were ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances, making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, unaware that the very scope of their collective enthusiasm was creating the conditions for disaster. Sleep comes easier when we understand rather than judge, when we recognize our shared humanity with those who came before. So rest here, in 1845 Britain, watching the railway mania at its peak, beautiful in its way, terrible in what it would become, but in this frozen moment simply human. People hoping, dreaming, reaching for prosperity, building a future they believed would be glorious. Let that image fade gently as sleep approaches, the railways spreading across Britain like a promise, the shares changing hands like currency of hope, the future bright and beckoning before the shadows of doubt arrived. The extraordinary thing about financial manias is how completely they can grip not just individual minds, but entire societies, transforming rational behaviour into something that, in retrospect, looks like collective madness. The Railway Mania of 1845 and 1846 was such a moment when Britain became intoxicated by visions of iron rails stretching to every corner of the kingdom, when speculation became not just acceptable, but almost patriotic, when caution was dismissed as timidity and scepticism as failure of imagination. The numbers, when we look at them now, are staggering. In 1845 alone, over 600 railway schemes were registered. In 1846, another 390 were added. These weren't small local projects. Many proposed lines of 50, 70, 100 miles or more. The total capital these schemes sought to raise exceeded £300 million, an amount so vast it's hard to comprehend in the context of 1840s Britain. To put it in perspective, the entire national income of Britain was perhaps around £400 million per year. The railway schemes were seeking to raise nearly a year's worth of national income. Obviously, this was impossible. There wasn't remotely enough capital available to fund all these railways. Even if every scheme was worthy, even if the projections were accurate, the sheer volume made the collective endeavour absurd. But in the grip of mania, this impossibility wasn't acknowledged. Each investor focused on their particular investments, on the specific schemes that seemed most promising. The aggregate, the total madness of it all, somehow escaped notice. The process of subscribing for shares in these schemes became a kind of ritual, repeated thousands of times across Britain. You would read about a new railway in the newspaper, or hear about it from friends. Perhaps it was the Direct Northern Railway, proposing to connect London to York by a more direct route than existing lines, or the Scottish Central Junction Railway, planning to link Glasgow to Edinburgh and beyond, or the Exeter and Crediton Railway, a modest scheme serving Devon. You would obtain a prospectus, either from a broker or directly from the railway company's offices. You would read, or perhaps merely skim, the details. The proposed route, the estimated cost, the projected revenues, the promised dividends. Then you would make your decision. If you chose to subscribe, you would sign your name to the subscription list and pay your deposit. Perhaps £2 per share, perhaps £5, rarely more than £10, even for shares with a nominal value of £20 or £50. Then you would wait. Wait to see if the subscription list filled, if the scheme attracted enough investors to proceed. Wait to see if the company would apply to Parliament for its authorising act. Wait to see if your shares would rise in value on the secondary market, allowing you to sell at a profit even before construction began. The waiting was full of hope and anxiety, checking share prices in the newspapers, discussing prospects with other investors, calculating potential profits. For many people, this became an obsession. Railway investment wasn't a sideline or a hobby. It consumed their attention. Businessmen neglected their trades to focus on railway speculation. Professionals spent hours that should have been devoted to clients or patients studying railway prospectuses and share prices. Households debated which schemes to invest in over dinner tables. The railway mania became the dominant topic of conversation in many circles. The social pressure to participate was immense. If everyone you knew was investing in railways, if the talk at every social gathering centred on which schemes were rising and which were falling, if you saw friends and neighbours profiting from railway speculation, the pressure to join in became nearly irresistible. Not participating felt like being left behind, like missing the great opportunity of your generation, like failing to secure your family's financial future when the means to do so were readily available. Women, as we've noted, were particularly active investors. A prosperous widow in provincial England might have several £1,000s to invest, the inheritance from her late husband. In the 1840s, her investment options were limited. She couldn't easily buy property in her own name. She couldn't start a business without enormous social and legal obstacles. Government bonds paid minimal returns, but railway shares, these she could buy, hold, trade. They were respectable. They paid dividends that could supplement or even provide her income, and in 1845 and 1846 they seemed to promise wealth. So she would invest, perhaps cautiously at first, buying shares in an established railway. Then, seeing those shares rise in value, seeing the dividends arrive quarterly, she might subscribe to a new scheme, then another, then several more. Before long, her entire fortune might be tied up in railway shares, some in established companies but many in schemes that existed only on paper, railways that had neither parliamentary approval nor a single rail yet laid. The psychology of this is worth considering gently, with compassion for those who fell into the trap. These weren't stupid people. They weren't reckless by nature. They were making decisions that, in the context of the time, seemed rational. Railways had proven enormously successful. The established lines paid handsome dividends. The technology worked. The demand for better transport was real. All the evidence suggested that railways were the future, and that investing in that future was wise. What these investors couldn't see, what perhaps no one could see until it was too late, was that the very success of railways was creating conditions for disaster. Because railways were genuinely transformative, because they really did create value, it seemed reasonable to believe that more railways would create more value. And it was true, to a point. But that point was far lower than the mania assumed. Britain needed railways, but it didn't need £300 million worth of new railways all at once. The market couldn't distinguish between necessary railways and redundant ones, between well-planned schemes and hopeless fantasies. The prospectuses themselves became increasingly detached from reality. Early in the mania, prospectuses had been relatively sober documents, presenting plausible if optimistic projections. But as competition for investors intensified, as promoters tried to make their schemes stand out, the promises became more extravagant. Some prospectuses projected dividends of 15 or even 20%, returns that would have been extraordinary for any business, let alone an unbuilt railway facing uncertain demand. These projections were based on assumptions that would have seemed laughable if examined critically. They assumed that the proposed railway would capture all existing traffic from roads and canals. They assumed that the railway would generate substantial new traffic from people who currently didn't travel. They assumed that costs would be exactly as estimated with no overruns. They assumed that competing railways wouldn't reduce revenues. Stack enough optimistic assumptions together, and you could project any return you wanted. Some schemes were promoted by men who genuinely believed in their projects, who had convinced themselves that their railway would be the exception, the one that achieved all its projections. Others were promoted by men who knew the projections were unrealistic, but rationalized that all business ventures required optimism, that you had to paint the best possible picture to attract investors, and some, though perhaps fewer than you might think, were outright frauds, schemes created solely to extract money from investors with no intention of ever building a railway. For the average investor, distinguishing between these categories was nearly impossible. A prospectus was a prospectus, a set of promises backed by respectable names and official-looking documents. The fact that a scheme had hired an engineer, had created a provisional committee with titled members, had printed an elaborate prospectus with maps and financial projections, all of this created an impression of legitimacy that was often unwarranted. The secondary market in railway shares became increasingly frenzied. Shares in new schemes would be subscribed at a deposit of, say, £2 per share. Within days or weeks, those same shares might trade at a premium of £5 or £10, even though not a single rail had been laid, even though parliamentary approval was still uncertain. Investors called stags specialised in this. They would subscribe to any scheme they could, paying the small deposit, then immediately sell the shares at whatever premium the market would bear, pocketing the difference. This created perverse incentives. The goal wasn't to invest in railways that would eventually be built and generate profits. The goal was to identify schemes that would attract enough speculative interest to drive up the share price in the short term. Fundamentals, whether the railway made economic sense, whether the route was feasible, whether the cost estimates were realistic, became secondary to market momentum. The railway press played a complicated role in all of this. Newspapers like the Railway Times and the Railway Record provided essential information, share prices, company news, parliamentary proceedings. But they also had financial interests in the mania continuing. They sold advertising to railway companies and brokers. They charged companies to publish notices and prospectuses. The more railway activity there was, the more newspapers they sold, the more revenue they generated. This created a bias toward optimism, toward promoting new schemes, toward downplaying warnings or failures. Not everyone was swept up. The Economist, founded by James Wilson specifically to promote free trade and sound economic policy, consistently warned about the mania. Wilson understood that the proliferation of railway schemes was unsustainable. He calculated that if all the proposed railways were built, Britain would have far more railway capacity than it needed, that many lines would struggle to generate sufficient traffic to cover their costs, that investors were heading for disaster. His warnings were published regularly through 1845 and 1846. They were logical, well-argued, grounded in careful analysis, and they were largely ignored. Readers dismissed Wilson as a pessimist who didn't understand the transformative power of railways. They pointed to the success of existing railways as proof that skepticism was unwarranted. They believed, in the way that people in the grip of mania always believe, that this time was different, that the old rules didn't apply, that the future would be more glorious than cautious analysts could imagine. George Hudson, the railway king, was at the height of his influence during this period. He controlled or influenced multiple railway companies. He sat in Parliament. He entertained lavishly at his houses in London and Yorkshire. He was courted by aristocrats and treated as a financial genius. The railways he managed continued to pay good dividends, and he seemed to have a golden touch. Everything he was involved with succeeded. What wasn't known, what wouldn't be discovered for several more years, was that some of Hudson's success was illusory. He paid dividends from capital rather than profits, making his railways appear more profitable than they actually were. He manipulated accounts, moving money between different railway companies he controlled to hide problems. He engaged in insider trading, buying land along planned routes before the routes were publicly announced, then selling to his own companies at inflated prices. These practices were, if not quite legal, at least not clearly illegal under the loose regulations of the time. But in 1845 and 1846, Hudson's reputation remained intact. He was a symbol of what railway investment could achieve, living proof that modest origins were no barrier to wealth and power in the railway age. His involvement in a scheme was enough to make investors confident. If Hudson was promoting it, it must be sound. This trust was misplaced, but it was deeply felt and widely shared. By the late summer and autumn of 1845, the mania reached truly extraordinary levels. The number of schemes being promoted exceeded any rational assessment of what the country needed or could sustain. Parliamentary committees were overwhelmed with bills seeking authorization. The legal profession was making enormous profits from the fees associated with parliamentary applications. Engineers were spread impossibly thin, trying to survey dozens of routes simultaneously. The entire edifice of railway promotion had become disconnected from the reality of railway operation. Dinner parties in middle-class homes became dominated by railway talk. Husbands and wives debated which schemes to invest in. Servants overheard their employers' conversations and made their own modest investments, hoping to share in the prosperity. Clergymen invested their church's funds in railway shares. Teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, all participated, all convinced that they were securing their futures, that they were participants in Britain's transformation into a modern, railway-connected nation. There was something touching about this collective enthusiasm, this shared belief in progress and prosperity. These were, for the most part, decent people trying to make prudent decisions for themselves and their families. They weren't greedy speculators or reckless gamblers, at least not in their own minds. They were responsible citizens investing in their country's infrastructure, supporting the technological advancement that would benefit everyone. But enthusiasm, however well-intentioned, can become dangerous when it loses touch with reality. And the railway mania, by late 1845, had thoroughly lost that touch. The schemes being promoted exceeded any plausible need. The capital being sought couldn't possibly be raised. The resources required, engineers, labour, materials, didn't exist in sufficient quantities. The whole structure was unsustainable, and yet it continued to grow, driven by momentum, by social pressure, by the hope that the expansion could continue indefinitely. Autumn turned to winter, and 1845 gave way to 1846. The new year brought a continuation of the mania, but also the first real signs of strain. Interest rates, which had been low for years, began to rise. The Bank of England, concerned about inflation and the excessive credit creation associated with railway speculation, tightened monetary policy. This made borrowing more expensive, which in turn made it harder for some investors to continue buying shares. Share prices, which had risen seemingly without limit through 1845, began to show more volatility in early 1846. Some schemes saw their share prices fall after initial enthusiasm waned. Others failed to attract sufficient subscriptions and were quietly abandoned. These were small warning signs, easily dismissed as the natural sorting of good schemes from bad, but they were there for anyone willing to see them. The parliamentary session of 1846 would be crucial. Hundreds of railway bills were submitted, each seeking authorisation to build. Parliament would have to decide which to approve and which to reject. The process would be long, expensive and contentious. And the outcome would determine which schemes could proceed toward actual construction, and which would collapse, taking investors' deposits with them. But in the early months of 1846, most investors remained optimistic. They believed their particular investments would be among those approved. They believed that the share prices would continue to rise. They believed that the future would vindicate their decisions, that they would look back on this period as the time when they wisely positioned themselves for prosperity in the railway age. This belief would be tested severely in the months ahead. The mania had reached its peak and was beginning, slowly at first, to crack under its own weight. But for now, in early 1846, Britain remained in the grip of railway fever. Investors clutching their share certificates, reading the railway press anxiously, calculating their paper wealth, hoping that the extraordinary moment they were living through would continue just a little longer, just long enough for them to realise their gains, to secure their futures, to participate in the prosperity that railways promised to all who believed. Let that image settle. Britain in early 1846. A nation transformed by railway speculation, families and fortunes tied to the success or failure of schemes that existed only on paper, the future bright with promise, but shadowed by risks that few acknowledged and fewer still understood. The peak had passed, though not everyone recognised it yet. The descent was beginning, gentle at first, almost imperceptible, but gathering momentum with each passing month, carrying with it the hopes and savings of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who had believed in progress, in technology, in the transformative power of railways, and who would soon learn the harsh lesson that not all promises are kept, not all visions realised, not all investments rewarded. Behind every statistic, every railway scheme, every fluctuating share price, there were human beings making decisions that would shape their lives and their families' futures. Let's slow down for a moment and consider who these investors actually were, what motivated them, how they experienced the railway mania not as historical abstraction, but as lived reality, as hope and fear and calculation and dreams. Consider a woman we might call Elizabeth, though that's not her real name. She's a composite, but her story reflects the experiences of many actual women in 1845 Britain. Elizabeth is 42 years old, a widow living in a market town in the Midlands. Her husband, a successful draper, died 3 years ago, leaving her with 2 teenage children and a modest fortune of about £3,000. This is enough to live on comfortably if managed carefully, generating perhaps £90 or £100 per year in income from government bonds, supplemented by rents from a small property her husband owned. But Elizabeth has worries. Her son will need university education, which will cost money. Her daughter will need a dowry when she marries. The income from bonds seems barely adequate, with no margin for unexpected expenses, and Elizabeth has heard from friends, that railway shares offer much better returns than government bonds. 8%, 10%, sometimes more. If she could shift some of her capital from bonds to railways, she could increase her income significantly, provide better for her children, secure their futures. So Elizabeth begins cautiously. In early 1844, she sells £500 worth of government bonds and buys shares in the London and Birmingham Railway, an established company with a proven record. The shares paid dividends of 9%, nearly 3 times what the bonds paid. She receives her first dividend payment and feels a quiet satisfaction. She made a good decision. She's being a responsible mother, a prudent manager of her late husband's estate. Encouraged by this success, Elizabeth subscribes to shares in a new scheme in autumn 1844, the Leicester and Bedford Railway, a modest line connecting 2 towns in her region. She invests £300. Within weeks she hears that the shares are trading at a premium. On paper, her investment has already appreciated. She hasn't sold, preferring to wait for the railway to be built and provide regular dividends, but knowing the shares have gained value gives her confidence. By spring of 1845, Elizabeth has invested in 4 different railway schemes. Some are established companies, others are new proposals. She's invested about half her capital in railways, keeping the rest in bonds and property for security. She attends a company meeting for one of the railways. Women are allowed to attend as shareholders, though they cannot vote. She sits quietly in the back of the room, listening to the directors present optimistic reports about progress and prospects. She feels part of something larger, something modern and progressive. As the mania intensifies through 1845, Elizabeth finds herself subscribing to more schemes. Her friends talk constantly about railways. Her neighbour, another widow, has apparently made substantial profits. The draper who now runs the business her late husband founded mentions his own railway investments. Elizabeth reads the railway press. She sees that some of her holdings have doubled in value. She begins to think that perhaps she's been too cautious, that she should invest more aggressively. By autumn of 1845, Elizabeth has subscribed to shares in 12 different railway schemes. Some required deposits of just £1 or £2 per share, so she was able to spread her capital widely. On paper, her total holdings are worth perhaps £5,000, nearly double her original capital. She hasn't sold anything, so she hasn't actually realised these gains, but seeing the numbers in the newspaper each week calculating her wealth feels thrilling. She imagines telling her children that she secured their futures, that they won't need to worry about money, that their mother proved capable of managing finances as well as any man. But Elizabeth also feels anxiety. The calls for additional capital have begun arriving. The railways need money to pay for parliamentary expenses, for engineering work, eventually for construction. Each share she holds might require 5 or 10 or 15 more pounds in calls over the coming years. She has some ready money, but not enough to meet all possible calls. She'll need to sell some shares, or perhaps borrow against her property. The calculations that once seemed simple have become complicated, stressful. Late at night, after her children are asleep, Elizabeth sits at her desk with the railway newspapers spread before her, a candle burning, and tries to work out her finances, which shares to sell, which to hold, how to meet the calls that will come. She feels a creeping worry that perhaps she's overextended, that perhaps she should have remained conservative. But then she remembers her neighbour's success, remembers the dividends flowing from her established shares, and the worry recedes. She's doing what everyone else is doing. She's participating in Britain's railway future. It will work out. Now consider a different investor. We might call him Thomas, a clerk in a London office, unmarried, 35 years old. Thomas earns about £150 per year, enough to rent a modest room, eat adequately, dress respectably. He has managed to save about £80 over several years, money he keeps in a savings bank earning minimal interest. Thomas hears his colleagues at the office talking about railways constantly. They discuss schemes over lunch, compare which shares have risen most, boast about their growing wealth. Thomas initially ignores this, dismissing it as speculation unsuitable for someone of his modest means. But as months pass, as the talk continues and intensifies, as he sees colleagues dressing better, acting more confident, mentioning plans to marry now that they can afford it, Thomas begins to reconsider. In summer of 1845, Thomas takes a bold step. He withdraws his £80 from the savings bank and subscribes to shares in 4 different railway schemes. The deposits are small, £2 per share in most cases, so he's able to subscribe for 40 shares across the 4 schemes. The nominal value of these shares is £800, 10 times what he actually paid. But Thomas understands that calls will come, that he'll need to pay more. He's planning for that, saving aggressively, hoping that some shares will rise enough that he can sell them to fund the calls on others. For Thomas, railway investment is intensely emotional. This is his chance to escape the grinding existence of a clerk's life, to accumulate capital that could allow him to start a business or marry or retire early. He checks share prices obsessively, buying the Railway Times each week even though it costs 6p he can barely afford. He makes complex calculations in the margins of the newspaper. If these shares rise to this price, if he sells these and holds those, if the calls don't exceed this amount, then he could have £200, £300, maybe more. He also feels shame about his obsession. He knows he's neglecting his work, that his mind wanders during office hours to railway calculations. He knows his colleagues who didn't invest regard him with a mixture of pity and disdain. pity because he's risking money he can't afford to lose, disdain because speculation is somehow ungentlemanly for someone of his station. But Thomas can't stop. The potential rewards are too tantalizing. The fear of missing out is too powerful. By early 1846, Thomas is in trouble. Calls have arrived for additional payments on his shares. He's scraped together what he could, but he's short. He's borrowed money from a colleague at work, promising to repay with interest from his anticipated profits. He's sold his watch. He's moved to a cheaper room in a worse neighbourhood. He's eating less, spending nothing on entertainment or socialising. His entire existence has become focused on railways, on holding his shares until they rise enough to justify the sacrifices. Thomas lies awake at night in his shabby room, doing mental arithmetic, calculating and recalculating. If the schemes get parliamentary approval, if construction proceeds, if the shares rise as he hopes, he'll emerge triumphant. He'll have £300, maybe 400. He could leave his clerkship, start a new life. But if the schemes fail, if he can't meet the calls, if he's forced to forfeit his shares, he'll have lost everything. 3 years of savings gone, plus the borrowed money he'll have to repay somehow. The possibility of ruin keeps him awake, staring at the ceiling, alternating between hope and dread. Let's consider one more investor, different again. James is a country clergyman, 48 years old, married with 3 children. His living provides a comfortable but not lavish income, about £250 per year. He inherited a small sum from his parents, about £1,000, which he's invested conservatively in government bonds and the funds of his parish church. James is a thoughtful, educated man. He reads widely, follows public affairs, considers himself prudent in financial matters. He's initially sceptical of the Railway Mania, viewing it as speculative excess, unsuitable for a man of the church. But several things change his mind over the course of 1845. First, his brother-in-law, a businessman he respects, shows him the dividends he's receiving from railway investments. The amounts are significant, and the brother-in-law makes a persuasive case that railways are genuine enterprises creating real value, not mere speculation. Second, James's bishop mentions in conversation that he's invested church funds in certain railway companies, viewing it as proper stewardship to seek the best returns for money held in trust. If the bishop thinks railways are appropriate investments, surely James can too. Third, and perhaps most importantly, James begins to think about his children's futures. His eldest son is academically gifted and could attend university, but the cost is daunting. His daughter will need a dowry. His younger son shows no scholarly aptitude and will need capital to enter a trade or profession. The modest income from bonds won't provide for these needs. But if James could increase his capital through judicious railway investment, if he could turn his £1,000 into £2,000 over a few years, he could give his children opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. So James invests, but carefully. He spends weeks researching different schemes, reading prospectuses, consulting with the few people whose judgment he trusts. He chooses what seem like the most solid proposals: railways connecting major cities, lines through productive agricultural regions, schemes promoted by reputable men. He avoids anything that seems speculative or uncertain. By late 1845, James has invested about £600 in railway shares, keeping the rest in safe investments. He's chosen 5 different companies, diversifying to reduce risk. He attends company meetings when they're held near his parish, asking thoughtful questions, trying to assess the competence of the directors and the viability of the schemes. But James also feels a gnawing unease. His parishioners have noticed his railway investments. News travels in small communities. Some have asked his advice, which he's reluctant to give. What if he's wrong? What if the schemes fail? He'd lose his own money, which would be bad enough, but he'd also have to face the people who trusted his judgment. And deeper still, James worries about the morality of it all. Is seeking profit from railways any different from usury, from money lending? Is he betraying his calling by participating in commercial speculation? He wrestles with these questions in his study, sometimes writing out arguments on both sides in his journal. On one hand, providing for his family is a sacred duty. Using resources wisely, seeking good stewardship, is not sinful but virtuous. Railways are beneficial enterprises, improving commerce and communication. Investing in them is supporting progress. On the other hand, the obsession with wealth accumulation, the constant calculation of share prices, the anxiety about calls and dividends, this all feels spiritually corrosive. A distraction from his true vocation. James decides he'll hold his investments but make no new ones. He'll wait and see. If the railways prove successful, if his careful choices yield the returns projected, he'll thank Providence and use the money for his children. If they fail, he'll accept it as a lesson in humility, and perhaps a deserved consequence of allowing worldly concerns to dominate his thoughts. These three investors, Elizabeth, Thomas, James, represent different positions in society, different resources, different motivations, but they share certain experiences. All are trying to make prudent decisions with limited information. All are influenced by social pressure and the visible success of other investors. All experience anxiety alongside hope, doubt alongside confidence. All have invested money they can't easily afford to lose, though the consequences of loss vary dramatically for each. Multiply these individual stories by hundreds of thousands, and you begin to see the human reality of the Railway Mania. This wasn't an abstract financial event. It was countless people sitting in their homes, making calculations, weighing risks, trying to secure their futures and their families' futures, making decisions that seemed rational at the time, but were shaped by forces they didn't fully understand. The psychology of crowds, the contagion of enthusiasm, the difficulty of maintaining perspective when everyone around you seems to be profiting. The diversity of investors is worth noting. Wealthy landowners invested tens of thousands of pounds. Middle-class professionals invested hundreds or thousands. Working-class individuals with modest savings invested tens. Women were well represented among investors, perhaps more so than in any previous financial event. The Railway Mania was, in a strange way, democratic. Anyone with a few pounds could participate, could hope to benefit from Britain's railway transformation. There were regional variations too. In the Midlands and the North, where railways were already transforming industry and commerce, enthusiasm was particularly intense. In London, the financial centre, speculation was sophisticated and aggressive. In rural areas, investment was more cautious but still widespread. No part of Britain was untouched by the mania. The emotional experience of being an investor during this period was characterised by volatility. One week, you might read that your shares had risen 20% and you'd feel elated, validated in your judgment, financially secure. The next week, share prices might fall, and you'd feel anxious, wondering if you should sell before things got worse. Then they might rise again, and you'd feel relief, foolish for having doubted. This emotional rollercoaster, sustained over months, was exhausting. Family dynamics were often strained. Husbands made investment decisions without consulting wives, or vice versa. Adult children pressured elderly parents to invest or not to invest. Siblings argued about whether inherited money should be put into railways. The stakes felt enormous. Not just money, but family security, children's futures, old age comfort. These weren't abstract portfolio decisions, but intimate family matters. Some people maintained perspective. They invested a small portion of their capital, hoped for the best, but didn't obsess over share prices. They went about their lives, checking occasionally on their investments, but not allowing railways to dominate their thoughts. These people, often older, more experienced with financial matters, or simply more psychologically stable, would emerge from the mania relatively unscathed. But many others lost perspective entirely. They spent hours each day reading railway news, calculating share values, planning their next subscriptions. They talked about nothing else. They dreamed about railways. Their entire sense of self-worth became tied to their success or failure as railway investors. For these people, the eventual collapse would be not just a financial disaster, but a psychological catastrophe. There were moments of collective euphoria. When a particularly anticipated scheme opened its subscription list and was oversubscribed within hours, when an established railway announced higher than expected dividends, when Parliament approved a significant number of schemes, these moments created waves of optimism that swept through investor communities. People congratulated each other, clinked glasses at railway company dinners, felt part of a successful enterprise, participants in Britain's glorious railway future. But there were also moments of doubt, usually experienced privately, late at night, looking at your accounts, realizing how much capital you'd committed, wondering what would happen if things went wrong, reading an article questioning whether Britain needed quite so many railways, hearing about a scheme that had collapsed, leaving investors with nothing. These moments of doubt were uncomfortable, unwelcome. Most investors pushed them away, focusing instead on the positive news, the rising share prices, the dividends flowing from successful companies. By early 1846, many investors were deeply committed. They held shares in multiple schemes. They had deposits paid and faced future calls for additional capital. They couldn't easily exit their positions even if they wanted to. Selling would often mean realizing losses on schemes that hadn't yet reached peak value. The only way forward seemed to be continuing, hoping that the railways would be built and prove profitable, that the gamble would pay off. Let yourself sit with these human stories for a moment. These weren't foolish people or reckless speculators, at least not most of them. They were ordinary individuals trying to navigate an extraordinary situation, making decisions with imperfect information, influenced by social forces they didn't fully recognize, hoping to benefit from technological transformation that was genuine and observable. They deserve our compassion, not our judgment. They were us, in different circumstances, facing different challenges, but fundamentally the same. Hopeful, anxious, trying to do right by themselves and those they loved, making the best decisions they could with the knowledge they had. The Railway Mania was ultimately a human story, not just a financial one. It was about how hope can become delusion, how collective enthusiasm can override individual judgment, how the promise of prosperity can lead people to take risks they'd normally avoid. But it was also about genuine aspiration, about people trying to participate in progress, to improve their circumstances, to believe in a better future. Both things can be true simultaneously. The mania was destructive and yet rooted in understandable human desires. As we continue through the story, as we watch the mania reach its peak and then begin its slow collapse, remember these individual investors. Remember Elizabeth worrying about her children's futures, Thomas calculating desperately in his shabby room, James wrestling with moral questions in his study. Remember that every rising or falling share price represented someone's hope or fear, someone's gain or loss, someone's vindication or ruin. The numbers matter, but the humans behind the numbers matter more. The turn, when it came, was not a single dramatic moment but a slow recognition spreading through the investor community that something had changed, that the ground beneath their feet was no longer quite as solid as it had seemed, that the promises of endless prosperity might not be kept after all. The first tremors appeared in the autumn of 1845, though at the time they seemed insignificant. A few railway schemes that had been heavily promoted failed to attract enough subscribers and were quietly abandoned. Several established railway companies announced that their dividend payments would be lower than expected due to unexpected costs or disappointing revenues. These were small warnings, easily dismissed. Every market has failures. Every business faces setbacks. This didn't mean the whole edifice was unsound. But through the winter of 1845 and into 1846 the warnings accumulated. The Bank of England, concerned about inflation and the vast sums being channeled into railway speculation, began raising interest rates. In October 1845 the bank rate had been 2.5%. By January 1846 it had risen to 3%. By spring it would reach 3.5%. These increases might sound small, but they had significant effects. Higher interest rates made borrowing more expensive. Many investors had borrowed money to subscribe for railway shares, or to meet calls for additional capital. When interest rates rose, their debt became more costly to service. Some investors who had been managing their commitments when rates were low found themselves struggling when rates rose. They needed to sell shares to pay interest on their borrowings, which put downward pressure on share prices. Higher interest rates also made government bonds more attractive. If bonds now yielded 3.5% or 4% instead of 2.5% or 3%, they didn't look quite as inferior to railway shares paying 8 or 9%. The risk-adjusted return calculation shifted. Some investors began to think that perhaps the certainty of bond income was preferable to the uncertainty and volatility of railway shares. Share prices, which had risen almost continuously through 1845, began to behave differently in early 1846. They still rose sometimes, particularly for schemes that received positive news, but they also fell, sometimes sharply, when bad news emerged. The steady upward trajectory had been replaced by volatility, rises and falls, gains and losses. Hope and fear alternating week by week. Investors who had grown accustomed to checking the railway press and seeing their wealth increase were now confronted with a more unsettling reality. Their shares might be up one week and down the next. The paper wealth they had accumulated over months could disappear in days, then partly return, then disappear again. This volatility was psychologically exhausting, creating constant anxiety that hadn't existed when prices only went up. The parliamentary session of 1846 was crucial. Hundreds of railway bills had been submitted, each seeking authorization. Parliament created special committees to examine these bills, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. Each bill had to be considered individually, the route examined, the engineering assessed, the financial viability evaluated, the opposition from landowners and rival interests heard. The process was slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Companies spent enormous sums on parliamentary expenses, legal fees, engineering reports, compensating landowners who agreed not to oppose the bill, entertaining members of Parliament. All of this cost money. Some schemes spent tens of thousands of pounds just trying to get through Parliament, and there was no guarantee of success. Even schemes that seemed well-planned and well-funded could be rejected if opposition was strong or if committees decided the route was unnecessary or poorly conceived. As the parliamentary session progressed through spring of 1846, patterns emerged. Parliament was approving some bills but rejecting many others. The rejections were devastating for investors. When a scheme was rejected, all the money spent on parliamentary expenses was lost. The deposits investors had paid were often forfeit or worth very little. Shares that had been trading at premiums became essentially worthless overnight. The approvals were little better in some cases. Even schemes that received parliamentary authorization faced a harsh reality. Actually building the railway would cost far more than initial estimates suggested. Engineering surveys done to impress investors had been optimistic. When detailed construction planning began, when contracts were sought from builders and suppliers, the real costs became apparent. Many authorized railways faced the prospect of running out of money before completion. This created a crisis for investors. They held shares in railways that had parliamentary approval but needed far more capital than originally projected. The companies issued calls for additional payments, not the modest calls that had been expected, but large, urgent demands for capital. Investors had to decide, pay the calls and hope the railway could be completed, or refuse to pay and forfeit everything they'd already invested. For many investors, this was an impossible choice. They couldn't afford to pay the calls. They'd already invested everything they could spare. But refusing to pay meant losing their deposits and any appreciation their shares had achieved. It meant admitting defeat, accepting loss, confronting the reality that their investment had failed. Some investors borrowed money at the newly higher interest rates, desperately trying to meet the calls, hoping that somehow the railway would still succeed and justify their continued investment. Others simply couldn't pay and watched helplessly as their shares were forfeited. Thomas, the clerk we met earlier, was in this position. He'd subscribed for more shares than he could truly afford, counting on selling some at a profit to fund calls on others. But the share prices hadn't risen as he hoped. When calls arrived demanding additional payments, he had nothing left. He'd already borrowed from colleagues, sold his possessions, exhausted his savings. The shares were forfeit. 3 years of savings, gone. The borrowed money still owed. The psychological impact on investors like Thomas was crushing. He'd sacrificed so much, endured so much hardship, pinned all his hopes on railway shares lifting him out of his modest circumstances, and it had all been for nothing. Worse than nothing, he was now in debt, his financial position worse than when he started. The shame was overwhelming. He couldn't face his colleagues at work, couldn't meet the eyes of the man who'd lent him money. He'd been revealed as a fool, a naive speculator who thought he could get rich quick through railway shares. Elizabeth, the widow, faced a different but equally painful situation. She'd invested half her capital in railways, spreading it across multiple schemes. Some of her investments were in established railways that continued to pay dividends. These were holding their value reasonably well. But several of the new schemes she'd subscribed to were in trouble. One had been rejected by Parliament. Two others had received authorization but were demanding large calls she hadn't anticipated. Elizabeth had to make difficult decisions. She sold some of her shares in established railways to meet the calls on the newer schemes, hoping they would eventually succeed. This meant selling at less than ideal prices. Share prices for even the good railways had fallen from their peak. She was liquidating solid investments to fund questionable ones, but she couldn't bear the thought of forfeiting the newer shares and losing everything she'd paid for them. Her financial cushion was disappearing. The comfortable security she'd felt a year earlier had evaporated. She lay awake at night worrying about her children's futures, regretting her decisions, wishing she'd stayed conservative with government bonds, but she also told herself that perhaps it would still work out, that the railways would be built and become profitable, that she just needed to hold on through this difficult period. James, the clergyman, had chosen his investments more carefully, but he too faced challenges. 2 of the 5 railways he'd invested in had been rejected by Parliament. The shares were essentially worthless. One railway had received approval, but was demanding calls far beyond what the original prospectus had suggested. James had to decide whether to pay or forfeit. He chose to forfeit, accepting the loss of his deposit rather than throwing good money after bad. It was a rational decision, but it felt like failure. He'd lost perhaps £200, nearly a year's income for some of his parishioners, money that could have been used for his children's education. He felt foolish, irresponsible. He'd allowed himself to be swept up in speculation when he should have known better. The broader economic context made everything worse. In late 1845, the Irish potato crop failed catastrophically. Blight destroyed the potatoes that were the primary food source for millions of Irish people. The beginning of what would become the Great Irish Famine drew attention and capital away from railway speculation. Britain faced a humanitarian crisis on its doorstep. Food prices rose. The government debated how to respond. The atmosphere of optimistic speculation that had characterized 1845 gave way to a more somber mood in 1846. The crop failure affected Britain too, though not as catastrophically as Ireland. Harvests were poor, bread prices rose, working-class families struggled. The demand for railway excursion tickets, which had been a nice source of revenue for railway companies, declined as people had less money for leisure. The entire economic environment became more difficult. By the summer of 1846, the Railway Mania's peak was clearly past. Share prices for most railways, both established and new, had fallen significantly from their autumn 1845 highs. The subscription lists for new schemes that opened in summer 1846 attracted far fewer investors than similar schemes had 6 months earlier. The enthusiasm was draining away, replaced by caution and in some cases fear. The railway press, which had been relentlessly optimistic, began publishing more sober assessments. Articles appeared questioning whether Britain really needed quite so many railways, whether the approved schemes could all be built simultaneously, whether the capital existed to fund them all. The tone had shifted from celebration to concern, from encouragement to warning. But the real crisis was still ahead. Through 1846, the situation was difficult but not yet catastrophic. Share prices had fallen but not collapsed. Some railways were still being built successfully. Some investors were still making money. The damage was significant, but not total. There was still hope that things might stabilize, that the worst was over, that recovery might begin. This hope would prove unfounded. The year 1847 would bring something far worse than the difficulties of 1846. A genuine panic was coming, a financial crisis that would shake British banking and commerce, that would drive share prices to tiny fractions of their peak values, that would ruin thousands of investors and destroy the Railway King himself. But we're not quite there yet. Let's rest for a moment in late 1846, in the uncomfortable but not yet desperate situation many investors found themselves in. Their shares had lost value, yes, but they still held them, still hoped they might recover. They'd lost some money, yes, but they hadn't lost everything. They were anxious, worried, regretful, but not yet ruined. This liminal state, between the mania's peak and the coming crisis, between hope and despair, between modest losses and total ruin, was perhaps the most psychologically difficult period for many investors. They could see that things had gone wrong, but couldn't yet grasp how wrong. They knew they'd made mistakes but didn't want to accept the full consequences. They hoped that holding on, waiting it out, might somehow lead to recovery. Human nature in times of financial stress reveals itself in predictable patterns. We rationalize our decisions. We seek information that confirms what we want to believe. We avoid confronting the full reality of our situation. The investors of late 1846 engaged in all these behaviours. They told themselves that the parliamentary rejections were clearing away the bad schemes, that the remaining railways would be more profitable with less competition. They focused on the few railways that were still performing well, using these as evidence that their faith in railways wasn't entirely misplaced. They avoided calculating their total losses, preferring to look at each investment individually, rather than facing the aggregate damage. The social dynamics had changed too. A year earlier, railway investment had been a source of pride, something to discuss at social gatherings, a marker of being modern and forward-thinking. Now, it was a source of embarrassment. People who had boasted about their railway investments in 1845 were quiet about them in 1846. Conversations that had centred on which schemes were rising now carefully avoided the topic entirely. The collective enthusiasm had given way to a collective shame that no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Some investors, those who had been conservative or lucky, had sold near the peak and exited with profits. These fortunate few were sometimes resented by those still holding depreciating shares. How had they known to sell? Why hadn't they warned others? Of course, they hadn't known. They'd simply been cautious or fortunate in their timing. But their success felt like a reproach to those who'd held on too long, who'd believed too deeply in the railway dream. The winter of 1846 to 1847 brought a kind of grim settling. The mania was clearly over. The question now was how bad the aftermath would be. Would the railways that had been authorised actually be built? Would they prove profitable? Would investors recover some of their losses? Or would everything be lost? The uncertainty was agonising, and through that winter another pressure was building. The financial system itself, the banks, the credit networks, the whole edifice of commercial finance was under strain. Too much capital had been diverted into railway speculation. Too many loans had been made to investors who couldn't repay them. Too many banks held railway shares as collateral for loans, shares that were now worth far less than when the loans were made. The credit system, that invisible network of IOUs and promises and obligations that made modern commerce possible, was tightening. Banks that had freely lent money in 1845 were now calling in loans, refusing new credit, demanding payment. Businesses that depended on credit found it scarce and expensive. Interest rates, already higher than they'd been, continued to rise. By spring of 1847, the British economy was sliding into a genuine crisis, not just a railway speculation unwinding, but a broader financial panic that would touch every sector of commerce. The railway speculation had been the trigger, but the crisis spread far beyond railways, banks failed, businesses collapsed, credit froze. And share prices, which had fallen significantly through 1846, would fall much further in 1847, to levels that represented almost total destruction of value. But let's not rush to that crisis just yet. Let's sit for a while longer in the uncomfortable twilight of late 1846, when the damage was serious but not yet complete, when investors still held their shares and hoped for recovery, when the future was uncertain but not yet clearly catastrophic. This moment of suspension, of waiting to see how bad things would get, of hoping against evidence that somehow it wouldn't be as bad as feared, this is a very human moment, one we can understand and feel compassion for. The investors of late 1846 weren't dramatically different from how they'd been a year earlier. They were still the same people. Elizabeth still worried about her children. Thomas still hoped to escape his clerk's life. James still wrestled with questions of prudence and responsibility. But they'd learned some hard lessons. They'd discovered that what goes up can come down. That popular enthusiasm isn't the same as sound judgment. That new technologies, however transformative, don't automatically generate profits for investors. That the future is always less certain than it seems when we're imagining it. These lessons were being learned slowly, painfully, with money rather than with theory, and they would have to be learned again in future generations, because humans are remarkably good at forgetting financial lessons when presented with new opportunities that seem different from past mistakes. But for now, In 1846 Britain, the lessons were fresh and bitter, and the full cost of the Railway Mania was still being tallied, still accumulating, still spreading through families and communities, like a slow contagion of diminished expectations and lost security. Let that image rest. Britain in winter, 1846 to 1847, a nation sobered but not yet devastated, investors anxious but not yet ruined. The railway dream faded, but the railways themselves still being built across the countryside, iron and steam and human ambition continuing despite the financial chaos. Despite the losses, despite everything, the work went on, the railways were real, even if the speculation had been excessive. And that tension, between the genuine transformation railways represented and the destructive mania they'd inspired, that tension would shape how Britain remembered this episode and what it meant for the future. The crisis that had been building through 1846 broke fully open in 1847, and when historians later tried to calculate the destruction, the numbers told a story of devastation that touched nearly every corner of British financial life. The total capital authorised by Parliament for railway construction in the peak years of the mania exceeded £300 million, but of that enormous sum, only a fraction was actually raised and spent. Many authorised railways were never built. Investors had paid deposits but refused or couldn't afford to pay subsequent calls. The companies, unable to raise sufficient capital, simply abandoned their schemes. The parliamentary authorisation became worthless paper, the engineering plans filed away, the dreams of connection and profit dissolved. For investors who had paid deposits on these abandoned schemes, the loss was total. If you'd paid £2 per share as a deposit, planning to pay another £18 in calls over time, and the scheme was abandoned, your £2 simply vanished. Multiply that by thousands of shares across hundreds of schemes, and the aggregate loss becomes staggering. Tens of millions of pounds disappeared in this way, money that might have been in government bonds earning modest but safe returns, instead gone entirely. But the abandoned schemes, painful as they were, represented only part of the story. Some railways did get built, or partially built, using the capital that investors had provided, but many of these railways proved far less profitable than their prospectuses had promised. The projected dividends of 10 or 12 or 15% turned out to be fantasies. Many railways struggled to pay any dividend at all in their first years of operation. This created another kind of loss, not the complete destruction of abandoned schemes, but the slow erosion of value in schemes that technically succeeded. If you'd invested £1,000 in a railway that was built but paid only 2% instead of the promised 10%, you hadn't lost everything, but you'd lost the opportunity to have that £1,000 invested somewhere more profitable. And if you'd borrowed money to invest, paying perhaps 4 or 5% interest on the loan, receiving only 2% in dividends was the ongoing loss that compounded year after year. Share prices reflected this grim reality. Railway shares that had traded at hundreds of pounds at the peak of the mania fell to a fraction of those values. Some fell 90% or more from their peak. Established railways that had seemed solid saw their share prices cut in half or worse. New schemes that had traded at premiums before construction now traded at deep discounts to their nominal value, if anyone would buy them at all. The secondary market in railway shares, which had been so active in 1845, essentially froze in 1847. There were many more sellers than buyers. Anyone holding shares wanted to exit, wanted to cut their losses and salvage what they could. But who would buy? Why would anyone purchase railway shares when prices were falling, when dividends were disappointing, when the whole sector was clearly in crisis? The lack of buyers meant that even investors desperate to sell often couldn't find anyone willing to take their shares at any price. This illiquidity compounded the crisis. Investors were trapped holding assets they couldn't sell, forced to watch their paper wealth evaporate, unable to exit even as the situation worsened. Some investors who might have survived with modest losses if they could have sold in early 1846 found themselves facing ruin in 1847 because the market had seized up. The legal structure of railway companies created additional pain for investors. Unlike modern limited liability companies, where shareholders can only lose what they've invested, railway shareholders in the 1840s faced potentially unlimited liability. If a railway company went bankrupt owing money to creditors, those creditors could demand payment from the shareholders, You might have already paid the full nominal value of your shares, might have already lost most of your investment, and then received demands for additional payments to cover the company's debts. This terrifying prospect drove some investors to desperate measures. They tried to transfer their shares to relatives or friends who had no assets, hoping to shield themselves from liability. They declared personal bankruptcy preemptively to protect what wealth they had left. They fled to the continent to escape British creditors. The legal battles over railway company debts would continue for years, adding legal fees to the direct financial losses. George Hudson, the railway king, fell dramatically during this period. Hudson's railway empire had been built partly on genuine achievement. He had created functional railway networks, consolidated small lines into larger systems, demonstrated real management ability. But he'd also engaged in accounting manipulations that became increasingly difficult to sustain as the crisis deepened. Hudson had paid dividends from capital rather than profits, making his railways appear more successful than they actually were. This worked as long as share prices kept rising, as long as new investors kept buying shares and providing fresh capital. But when the market turned, when share prices fell, and new investment dried up, the scheme collapsed. Audits revealed that Hudson's railways were far less profitable than he'd claimed, that debts had been hidden, that money had been moved between different companies he controlled in ways that were, if not quite illegal, deeply improper. In 1849, Hudson was forced to resign from the railway companies he controlled. Investigations revealed the extent of his manipulations. He faced lawsuits from angry shareholders who'd relied on his fraudulent reports. His reputation, once so sterling that his involvement guaranteed investor confidence, was destroyed. The Railway King became a symbol of the mania's excesses and deceptions. He lived another 20 years but never recovered his former position or wealth. Hudson's fall was dramatic and public, but countless other failures happened more quietly. Small investors who lost their savings didn't make the newspapers. Families who had to sell their homes, who postponed marriages, who couldn't afford their children's education. These private tragedies happened by the thousands, undocumented except in the memories of those who lived them. Elizabeth, the widow we met earlier, managed to avoid total ruin but suffered significant losses. The established railway shares she'd invested in early maintained some value, though much reduced from their peak. These continued to pay modest dividends, providing some income. But the newer schemes she'd subscribed to mostly failed. She lost perhaps a third of her original capital. Her comfortable security became precarious. She'd have to be much more careful with expenses. Her son's university education would have to be reconsidered. Her daughter's dowry would be smaller than hoped. Elizabeth felt the shame of failure even though her losses were modest compared to many. She'd thought herself prudent and intelligent in her investment decisions. She'd attended company meetings, read prospectuses, chosen carefully, and still she'd lost a substantial portion of her late husband's estate. She couldn't escape the feeling that she'd betrayed his trust, that he would have been disappointed in her stewardship. At night, she sometimes cried quietly, not just for the money lost, but for the confidence and optimism that had disappeared with it. Thomas, the clerk, was ruined completely. He'd lost his entire savings, remained in debt to colleagues who'd lent him money, and faced years of working to repay those debts, with no prospect of accumulating capital again. The railway speculation had destroyed any chance he had of escaping his modest circumstances. He would remain a clerk, earning just enough to live and repay his debts until age or illness forced him from employment. The bitter knowledge that his own decisions had trapped him in this fate was almost harder to bear than the poverty itself. Thomas became withdrawn, silent. His colleagues, some of whom had also lost money in railways though not as catastrophically, avoided discussing finances around him. They could see his shame and wanted to spare him additional pain, but their kindness made it worse in some ways, making him constantly aware of his status as an object of pity. He considered emigrating to America or Australia, starting over where no one knew of his failure. But he lacked the money even for passage. He was stuck, doomed to live out his life in the shadow of his mistakes. James, the clergyman, had limited his losses by forfeiting shares in schemes he judged unlikely to succeed, rather than paying additional calls. He lost perhaps £300 total, a significant sum, more than a year's income but not a catastrophic proportion of his wealth. He still had his living, still had income from his position, still had some capital remaining. But James struggled with the moral and psychological aftermath. He'd allowed himself to be swept into speculation. He'd made decisions based on greed. He could call it providing for his children, but beneath that justification was simple desire for wealth. He'd betrayed his calling, or so he felt. His sermons on the vanity of worldly pursuits rang hollow to his own ears now. How could he preach against avarice when he'd succumbed to it himself? James became more austere in his habits, almost punitive. He gave more to charity, ate simpler food, denied himself small pleasures. This was partly financial necessity, but it was also penance, a way of atoning for his lapse. He hoped that through discipline and self-denial, he might regain the moral clarity he felt he'd lost during the mania. His family found him more distant, harder to reach. The railway losses had cost him more than money. They'd cost him his peace of mind. The broader British economy suffered through 1847 and into 1848. The railway crisis coincided with crop failures and high food prices. Working-class families faced genuine hardship. Political unrest grew. The Chartist movement demanding democratic reforms gained renewed energy. There were demonstrations, strikes, fears of revolution spreading from the continent where 1848 saw uprisings across Europe. The banking sector experienced severe stress. Many banks had lent money to railway investors or had invested their own capital in railway shares. When share prices collapsed, the value of loan collateral evaporated, leaving banks holding bad debts. Some banks failed outright. Others survived, but only by calling in loans and refusing new credit, which spread the distress to other sectors of the economy. Credit contraction meant that businesses unconnected to railways felt the impact. A manufacturer who'd relied on bank credit to buy raw materials might find credit suddenly unavailable. A merchant who'd used credit to stock inventory might face demands for immediate repayment. The ripple effects spread through the entire commercial network, turning what had begun as railway speculation into a broader economic crisis. Interest rates, which had risen through 1846, spiked higher in 1847 as credit became scarce and banks demanded higher compensation for risk. Borrowing became expensive and often simply unavailable. This made everything harder. Businesses couldn't invest in expansion, home buyers couldn't get mortgages, even government borrowing became more costly. The human cost of the crisis extended far beyond the investors who'd directly lost money. Railway construction slowed dramatically as companies ran out of capital or went bankrupt. This meant that the thousands of navvies who'd been employed building railways lost their jobs. These were men without savings, living hand-to-mouth, supporting families. When railway construction stopped, they had no income and few alternatives. Some found work in agriculture or other manual labour. Others simply suffered, their families going hungry, moving from place to place seeking any employment. The irony was that even amid this crisis, railways continued to transform Britain. The lines that had been built, that had survived the financial chaos, continued to operate. They still carried passengers faster and cheaper than coaches had. They still moved freight more efficiently than canals. The technology worked. The transformation was real. But the financial structure built around that technology had been catastrophic. Britain would eventually have about 20,000 miles of railway track. Much of that was built during or immediately after the Mania years, funded by the capital raised from investors in 1845 and 1846. So in a strange sense, the Mania accomplished something. It created the railway network, just at enormous cost to those who provided the capital. Future generations would benefit from railways built with money that investors in the 1840s had lost. This raises uncomfortable questions about progress and sacrifice. Was the railway network worth the financial devastation of hundreds of thousands of investors? Would the railways have been built more sensibly, more gradually, without the Mania? Or did the Mania, destructive as it was, accelerate railway construction in a way that benefited society, even if it harmed individual investors? These questions don't have easy answers. Both things can be true. The railways were valuable, and the cost imposed on investors was terrible and unjust. By 1848 and 1849, the acute crisis was passing. Share prices had stabilised at their new, much lower levels. Banks that were going to fail had failed. Credit was slowly becoming available again. The economy was beginning to recover, but the damage was done. Wealth that had taken years to accumulate had been destroyed in months. Lives had been reshaped by loss. Families had been changed by financial catastrophe. The reckoning was also legal and regulatory. Parliament investigated the railway companies, looking at how capital had been raised and spent, how prospectuses had been constructed, whether fraud had occurred. Some prosecutions resulted, though most promoters escaped legal consequences. The standards for financial disclosure were tightened somewhat. The joint stock company regulations were reformed, eventually leading to modern limited liability laws that would protect future investors from the unlimited liability that had compounded losses in the railway crisis. These reforms came too late to help the investors of 1845, but they changed British finance permanently. The Railway Mania had exposed weaknesses in financial regulation, in corporate governance, in the mechanisms for protecting investors from fraud and misrepresentation. The response, gradual and imperfect, created frameworks that would shape British capitalism for generations. But no amount of regulatory reform could restore what had been lost. The money was gone, the trust was broken, the optimism that had characterized the mania's peak had curdled into cynicism and caution. A generation had learned through painful experience that financial manias promise much and deliver disaster, that popular enthusiasm is a poor guide to investment decisions, that new technologies create genuine value but don't automatically make investors wealthy. These lessons would fade over time. New manias would emerge in future decades and centuries, as humans repeatedly convinced themselves that this time was different, that this new opportunity was unique, that the old patterns didn't apply. But for those who lived through the Railway Mania, the lessons were permanently etched in memory and in pocketbooks. They would never again trust quite so easily, never again believe quite so thoroughly in promises of easy wealth, never again participate quite so enthusiastically in collective financial enthusiasm. Let that image settle. Britain in the late 1840s, counting its losses, burying its dead dreams, slowly rebuilding from the wreckage of the Railway Mania. The railways remained, steel ribbons across the landscape, monuments to both human ingenuity and human folly. The investors remained too, poorer now, chastened, living with the consequences of decisions made in hope and confidence just a few years earlier. The gap between what had been promised and what had been delivered was vast, measured not just in pounds sterling but in broken plans, diminished futures, lives reshaped by financial catastrophe that could have been avoided but wasn't, couldn't have been avoided given human nature, and would happen again in different forms because humans are what we are: hopeful, ambitious, forgetful, forever reaching for prosperity and sometimes grasping only loss. The paradox at the heart of the Railway Mania was this: the speculation was disastrous for investors, yet the railways themselves transformed Britain in ways that were profound, lasting, and ultimately beneficial. The financial crisis was real and devastating. But so too was the railway revolution. Both things happened simultaneously, intertwined in ways that make simple judgments about the mania's legacy almost impossible. Let's consider what Britain looked like in 1850, just a few years after the crisis, and compare it to Britain in 1840, before the mania began. The transformation is remarkable. In 1840, Britain had perhaps 2,000 miles of railway track, concentrated in certain regions, connecting major cities but leaving vast areas unserved. By 1850, the network had expanded to more than 6,000 miles. This wasn't quite the 20 or 30,000 miles that would eventually be built, but it represented a fundamental change. The major cities were now connected by rail. Secondary cities and towns had rail service. The coalfields, the ports, the manufacturing districts, all were linked by iron rails. This connectivity changed the basic geography of British life. Consider the journey from London to Edinburgh, the capital separated by nearly 400 miles. In 1840, this journey by coach took the better part of a week, assuming good weather and no mishaps. It was expensive, uncomfortable, and frankly, dangerous. By 1850, you could travel from London to Edinburgh by rail in about 12 hours. 12 hours instead of a week. The psychological compression of distance was extraordinary. Or consider the movement of goods. Fresh fish caught off the Scottish coast could reach London markets before spoiling. Milk from countryside farms could be in city homes the same day. Newspapers printed in London could be distributed to provincial cities by evening. the flow of information, food, goods, people, all accelerated dramatically. Time itself seemed to operate differently in a railway-connected nation. The impact on industry was transformative. The railways were themselves enormous consumers of iron, coal, and timber. A single mile of railway required tons of iron rails, wooden sleepers, stone for ballast, bricks for bridges and stations. The demand for these materials stimulated mining and manufacturing. Iron production in Britain increased dramatically through the 1840s and 50s, driven partly by railway construction. Coal mining expanded to fuel the locomotives and provide the coal transported by rail. The railways could move coal from mines to cities and factories far more efficiently than canals or wagons ever had. This made coal cheaper and more available, which in turn made steam power more economical for factories. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun with water power and canals, accelerated with steam and railways. Manufacturing patterns changed. Before railways, factories needed to be near canals or rivers for transport, near coal fields for power, near urban markets for customers. These constraints limited where industry could develop. Railways loosened these constraints. A factory could be built in a location chosen for labour availability or land costs, relying on rail transport for materials and products. Industrial geography became more flexible. Agriculture transformed in response to railways. Farmers could now grow crops for distant urban markets, knowing the railways would deliver them fresh. Dairy farming expanded near cities. Market gardening developed to supply fresh vegetables to urban populations. Agricultural specialisation increased as regions focused on what they grew best, relying on railways to bring in other necessities. This increased efficiency and productivity across the agricultural sector. The social impact was equally profound. Railways enabled a new phenomenon, commuting. Previously, people lived near where they worked. The wealthy might have country estates and townhouses moving seasonally. But the middle class lived above their shops or walked to their offices. Railways made it possible to live in suburban areas and travel to city jobs daily. This created the first suburban communities. Residential areas separated from but connected to urban employment centres. The railway station became a new kind of architectural monument. Major stations like Paddington, King's Cross, and St Pancras in London were built as grand structures, soaring iron and glass halls that proclaimed modernity and progress. Provincial cities built stations that were the finest buildings in town, sources of civic pride. The station became the gateway to the wider world, the place where journeys began and ended, where farewells and reunions happened, where the larger currents of national life touched individual experience. Railway time became standardised time. Before railways, each town kept its own local time based on the sun's position. Bristol time differed from London time by about 10 minutes. This didn't matter when travel was slow, but railways needed coordination. Trains couldn't run on schedules if every town had a different time, so railway companies adopted a standard time, eventually called Greenwich Mean Time, for their timetables. Gradually, the rest of society followed. By the 1850s, Britain operated on a single standardised time. This seems like a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift. Time itself became rationalised, standardised, part of the machinery of modern life. Travel became democratised. In the coaching era, long-distance travel was expensive and uncomfortable. Really only practical for the wealthy. Railways offered different classes of service at different prices. Third-class carriages were basic, sometimes just open wagons with benches, but they were cheap. Working-class people could afford occasional railway journeys. Families could visit relatives in distant towns. Workers could seek employment beyond their immediate locality. This mobility had social and economic effects that rippled through British society. Leisure travel emerged as a concept. Before railways, most people never travelled for pleasure. Holidays, if they existed at all, were spent at home. Railways made seaside resorts accessible. Blackpool, Brighton, Scarborough. These coastal towns grew as railway destinations where urban workers could spend a day or a weekend breathing sea air and paddling in the ocean. The railway excursion became a feature of working-class life, an escape from industrial cities, a taste of leisure that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The social mixing that occurred on railways was remarkable and sometimes controversial. Different classes travelled together, though in different carriages, but they shared stations, platforms, the experience of railway travel, A duchess and a shop girl might both be waiting for the same train, might both experience the same acceleration and speed. This created a kind of equality of experience that troubled some of the traditional hierarchy, but also represented the democratic impulse of the railway age. Railways enabled the growth of a truly national press. Newspapers printed in London could be distributed across the country the same day. Political news, market reports, cultural developments all circulated faster than ever before. This created a more unified national conversation, a shared awareness of events and issues that helped forge British national identity. Regional isolation diminished. Provincial readers could follow parliamentary debates, metropolitan cultural trends, international news, all with unprecedented immediacy. The economic benefits of the railway network once it was built were substantial and ongoing. The reduced cost of transport lowered prices for consumers. Competition between railway companies kept fares relatively affordable. The speed and reliability of rail transport made business operations more efficient. The whole economy benefited from better connectivity. This raises an interesting question about the relationship between the mania and the benefits. Would Britain have built its railway network without the mania? Could the network have been constructed more gradually, more carefully, with less financial destruction? Or did the mania, destructive as it was, serve a function by mobilizing capital on a scale that rational gradual investment couldn't have achieved? There's no definitive answer. You could argue that the mania was necessary, that only speculative excess could have channeled £300 million toward railway construction in just a few years. That rational investment would have been slower and more cautious, that Britain's railway network might have taken decades longer to build without the mania's intensity. Or you could argue that the mania was wasteful, that a significant portion of the capital raised was lost to fraud, mismanagement, and abandoned schemes, that more careful planning and regulation would have built the same network at lower cost with less human suffering. That the ends, however beneficial, didn't justify the means, didn't excuse the devastation visited on individual investors. Both perspectives have merit. The railways were built. They transformed Britain. Future generations benefited enormously. But that transformation came at a cost paid primarily by the investors of 1845 and 1846, many of whom saw little benefit from the railways their money built. They paid for infrastructure that served others, for progress that enriched future generations while impoverishing their own. There's something poignant about this asymmetry. The navvies who built the railways with pick and shovel didn't profit from them particularly. They earned wages, then moved on to other work or unemployment. The investors who funded the railways mostly lost money. But the railways remained, serving Britain for decades and eventually centuries, carrying millions of passengers and billions of tons of freight, creating value far exceeding what was destroyed in the mania. Economic historians have tried to calculate the social return on railway investment versus the private return. The social return, the benefit to society as a whole, was quite high. Railways really did make Britain more productive and prosperous. The private return, the profit to individual investors, was mostly negative or minimal. Society gained. Investors lost. This distribution of costs and benefits raises questions about justice and fairness that don't have easy answers. The railway companies that survived the crisis and operated successfully through the 1850s became solid businesses. They paid modest dividends, managed their operations competently, expanded gradually. Some of the shares that had been nearly worthless in 1847 recovered value over the following decades. Investors who held on, who didn't or couldn't sell during the crisis, eventually saw some return on their investment. Not the spectacular returns promised in the prospectuses, but something. George Hudson's railways, stripped of his fraudulent accounting, proved to be reasonably sound businesses. The networks he'd assembled in northern England continued to operate, were eventually absorbed into larger companies, formed part of Britain's permanent railway infrastructure. Hudson himself was disgraced, but his actual achievements in railway consolidation and network building were real, even if his financial methods were improper. The technology continued to improve. Locomotives became more powerful and efficient, rails became stronger, safety systems developed to prevent collisions and accidents. Railway engineering advanced. Brunel's broad gauge, which had seemed visionary during construction, was eventually abandoned in favour of Stephenson's standard gauge for the sake of network compatibility. But Brunel's other innovations, his bridges, his approach to route planning, his attention to passenger comfort, influenced railway development permanently. The railway network became integral to British military and imperial power. Troops could be moved rapidly by rail. Military supplies could be transported efficiently. This proved crucial during the Crimean War in the 1850s. Railways also became essential infrastructure for the British Empire, with railway construction spreading to India, Africa, Australia, following British investment and engineering expertise around the globe. The cultural impact of railways was lasting. Railway travel entered literature, art, music. Painters depicted railway stations and locomotives. Novelists set scenes on trains or in railway carriages. The rhythm of railway travel, the view from the window, the social dynamics of shared carriages, all became part of the texture of Victorian life and culture. Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope, and other writers incorporated railways into their work, sometimes critically, sometimes celebratively, but always recognizing their centrality to contemporary experience. For ordinary people in the 1850s, railways had become normal, part of the expected infrastructure of life. Children who grew up after the railway age arrived couldn't imagine a world without trains. The strangeness and wonder that people felt in 1830 or 1840 had faded. Railways were simply how you travelled, how goods moved, how the modern world worked. But those who remembered the time before railways, who had experienced the transformation, never quite lost the sense of wonder. To have lived through the change from coaching to railways was to have witnessed a genuine revolution in human capability. The compression of time and space, the speed and power of steam locomotion, the shrinking of Britain through connectivity, these remained remarkable for those who'd known the alternative. The environmental impact of railways was significant. They scarred the landscape with cuttings and embankments. They brought noise and smoke to previously quiet rural areas. They killed wildlife. They changed migration patterns of birds and animals. These impacts weren't really considered at the time. Progress was presumed to be worth any environmental cost, but they were real and lasting. The railway landscape became a permanent feature of Britain, visible still today, the marks of 1840s ambition carved into hillsides and spanning valleys. The social dislocation caused by railways, coaching inns closing, canal workers losing livelihoods, established economic patterns disrupted, created hardship for many even as railways created opportunities for others. Creative destruction, economists would later call it, the process by which new technologies and businesses destroy old ones. This is efficient from an economic perspective, but painful for those whose livelihoods depend on the superseded technology. By 1855, Britain had substantially completed its main railway network. Secondary lines would continue to be built for decades, and the total mileage would continue to grow, but the fundamental structure was in place. London was connected to every major city. The industrial regions were fully served. The major ports had rail connections. The network that the Mania had financed, that investors' money had built, was complete and operational, and it worked. Not perfectly. There were accidents, inefficiencies, continuing financial struggles for some companies, but overall, the railway network served its purpose. It moved people and goods quickly and relatively cheaply. It underpinned Britain's continued industrial growth and commercial dominance. It was infrastructure that would serve the nation for over a century, until roads and airways eventually reduced railways' centrality, though even today Britain's railways carry millions of passengers and remain important to the transport network. The irony is complete. The Railway Mania was a disaster that created something valuable. The speculation was irrational, but its object was rational. The investors suffered, but society benefited. The financial structure collapsed, but the physical structure endured. How do we make sense of this? How do we judge an event that was simultaneously destructive and constructive, wasteful and productive, a cautionary tale and a triumph? Perhaps we hold both truths together. The Railway Mania harmed many individuals while advancing collective progress. The suffering of Elizabeth and Thomas and James and thousands like them was real and unjust. But the railways their money built served Britain well and continue to carry passengers today. Both things are true. The Mania's legacy is mixed, as the legacy of most historical events is mixed when we look closely enough to see the human details alongside the broad historical trends. Let yourself rest with this complexity. Don't try to resolve it into a simple lesson or clear moral. History is complicated. The Railway Mania was complicated. It contained folly and wisdom, greed and hope, destruction and creation, all intertwined. The railways crossed the British landscape like iron threads, binding the nation together, carrying the future on their rails, monuments to both human achievement and human foolishness. Still there, still visible, still in use, the most tangible legacy of those wild years when Britain caught railway fever and paid a heavy price for the cure that came in the form of a permanent transformation of how space and time and human connection worked in the modern world. And so, we've travelled together through Britain's railway mania, from the slow world before the iron rails to the fever of speculation, through the dreams and disasters to the railways that remain today, carrying passengers across a landscape shaped by 1840s, ambition and folly. We've met the hopeful investors, Elizabeth, Thomas, James, ordinary people making decisions that seemed wise at the time, caught up in collective enthusiasm they couldn't resist, learning through loss what no prospectus could teach. We've watched fortunes made and lost on paper, watched a nation transform itself through speculative excess that was both destructive and creative, wasteful and productive. The railway tracks still cross Britain, monuments to both human vision and human weakness. The investors who paid for them mostly lost their money, but their sacrifice, unwitting though it was, built something that outlasted their suffering. History is like this, complicated, unfair, impossible to judge simply. If you've enjoyed this gentle exploration of financial history and human nature, a like helps others find their way here. And thank you for listening, for spending these hours drifting through the past with me. Wherever you are now, whatever weight you carried into this evening, let it ease. Let the railway mania fade into historical distance. Let the investors rest in their long sleep. Let the lessons settle quietly without demanding to be remembered. You've heard the story, that's enough. The trains still run, the world still turns, and you, dear listener, can finally rest. Sleep well, let go, good night.